It's the final game of the season for the 1998 Toronto Blue Jays. This franchise has managed to patch together their first winning season in years with a team that's kind of a traveling circus. They have a manager who inspires them by telling them war stories from his tour in Vietnam. They'll soon be fired after it's found out that he never went to Vietnam and he made all those stories up. But that's neither here nor there. The Jays also have a ton of star power. Even if you don't follow baseball at all, the names Roger Clemens and Jose Canseco probably ring a bell. But on this Sunday afternoon, the celebrity is somebody totally unexpected. As of 1 p.m. local time, he was a mostly unknown rookie pitching in just his second career game. By 2:45 p.m., he has become the most famous man in Toronto. He is the Jays' 21-year-old right-hander, Roy Halladay.
With just one inning to go until hibernating for the winter, Halladay's poised to make history. 25 times a batter has squared off against him, and not once did any legitimately reach base. On 24 occasions, the batter was retired, with Tigers first baseman Tony Clark getting aboard once on an error. Halladay is therefore on the verge of tossing Major League Baseball's 248th all-time no-hitter. A no-hitter is defined as pitching an entire game of at least 9 innings without allowing any hits. It's a feat so rare that many of the greatest pitchers of all time have never completed one. Whenever any pitcher anywhere in the world steps on the mound and sets to throw their first pitch, some small part of them always wonders whether this will be the day. With Halladay 3 outs away, the first batter he faces is Gabe Kapler, who promptly flies out. Then Davy Cruz is lifted in favor of pinch hitter Paul Bacco, who hits an easy ground ball for out number 26. Halladay is 1 out away. Butterfly effect aside, one could argue were it not for the aforementioned error that put Tony Clark on base, Bacco's grounder would have been out number 27. So at this moment, the game is simply not over when it otherwise would be. In steps another pinch hitter, left-handed slugger Bobby Higginson. Everyone in Toronto holds their breath as Halladay fires a first-pitch fastball headed straight toward the outer half of the plate.
A home run is a hell of a way to lose a no-hitter. Forget about making history, you don't even have a shutout anymore, but this baseball has far more important matters to attend to. You see, Higginson is late to bring his bat around. Maybe it's because he sat on the bench all day, his eyes are still getting used to the speed of the ball. Maybe it's because he doesn't expect Halladay to have this much gas in the tank this late in the game. Whatever the case, he smacks it to the opposite field. Higginson is decidedly not an opposite field hitter. He'll hit quite a lot of homers over the course of his career, but as is typical for hitters, he hits the ball hardest when he gets a little bit ahead of it. He's a left-handed batter, hence his homers just about always end up flying over the right field fence, with a few veering toward right center. Across his entire 11-year career, only 7 of his home runs, that's about 3% of them, will be hit directly to left field. And this is one of those 7. So maybe this is dumb luck, or maybe this baseball knows exactly where it needs to go. At the very end of the very last game of the season, it has no time to waste. It's on its way to pay a visit to an old friend. Halladay's teammates in the bullpen watch in agony as his no-hitter vaporizes over their heads. Only one of them possesses the spiritual fortitude to turn around and take in the entire show. Dave Stieb has about 90 seconds left in a Major League Baseball career that began almost 20 years ago. Consider the slim odds of this ball ending up on this side of the field to begin with, and then consider the near impossibility of this no-hitter splattering against the wall and caroming perfectly into Stieb's hands. It was saying goodbye to the man who, at his best, had understood it as well as anybody. Dave Stieb knows more about no-hitters than any other baseball player who has ever lived. It's 1982. Dave Stieb has pitched in Toronto for 4 years, and he's pretty fond of it. Growing up in California, he was so singularly dedicated to polishing his own baseball skills that he didn't follow Major League Baseball happenings all that closely, to the extent that he was only barely aware there were teams in Canada now. But he's come to love the fans in Toronto, who he finds less obnoxious than other fan bases, but no less proud. The Toronto Blue Jays are one of just 2 Canadian teams, and a losing season does nothing to dent their national pride. Besides, it's to be expected. The Jays are a very new franchise, having been founded in 1977, and new franchises lose a lot. Stieb, who landed here in 1979, has a less easy time with it. He's a perfectionist who wants to win, badly, and all of the time. On September 6th in Oakland, he's getting his wish. He's taken a no-hitter into the 7th inning. When exactly you start wondering about a no-hitter varies from fan to fan. Personally speaking, if I hear you've got a no-hitter going in the 5th, I'll keep a browser tab open for you. If you've got one going in the 7th, I'm going to turn on the game. Stieb's opponents, the Oakland Athletics, are having an off year, but he does have some dangerous hitters to find a way around. Job 1 has been to keep Ricky Henderson off base, and it's not an easy one. Over the course of his career, Stieb will hold the hitters of the American League to a .667 OPS, but Ricky has far better luck against him. The two will meet each other exactly 100 times in the regular season, and the differences between the two can be seen in their pregame rituals. Ricky stands naked in front of a mirror and stares at himself while telling himself Ricky's the best over and over. Stieb eats a tuna sandwich. Ricky's genius and athleticism make him one of the most disruptive, dangerous opponents baseball has ever seen. He's incredible at finding some means or another to get on first, and once he's there, he dances his ass off as he threatens to steal second base. He's such a distraction for your average pitcher that it's probably tempting just to let him have second and be done with it. Today, Stieb has managed to circumvent this problem entirely by popping Ricky out all 3 times. Stieb did issue a few walks early on, but in a no-hitter, things like walks, errors, and hit batsmen are allowed, meaning his masterpiece is intact by the time he faces power hitter Tony Armas with 1 out in the 7th. Having set down 19 Oakland hitters, he only needs to get 8 more out to achieve the first no-hitter in Toronto Blue Jays history. Unfortunately for him, and for us, and for you, Stieb is just about to blow it. But he's going to tell us a lot about who he is, both as a pitcher and as a human being, in the specific manner in which he blows it.
Stieb quickly gets ahead in the count 1-2 when his catcher, Gino Petralli, signals for a fastball. With 2 of them in his repertoire, the more effective is his two-seamer, which he throws with a velocity reaching the mid-90s and has biting movement. He starts it off generally right down the middle before letting it find its way to the edge of the plate at the last moment.
He gets Valdez his 4th strikeout.
The other is his four-seamer, which lacks movement and requires more pinpoint control.
He throws a strike.
While he throws fastballs about half the time, Dave's not interested in bringing the heat right now and shakes off his catcher, who then calls for a curveball. Constituting about 10% of his pitches, Stieb's got 2 of these in his bag as well. One is slow, in the 80-mile-an-hour range, and breaks downward as it approaches the plate. His hard curve is close to 90 miles an hour with a bit more of a sidearm delivery that makes it break across the plate. But once again, Stieb shakes his head. Fine. Now Petralli wants him to throw his money pitch, his slider. This is a pitch Stieb throws about 1/3 of the time and comes off appearing like a fastball before breaking sharply down and to the left. It simply ruins hitters' days. Royals Hall of Famer George Brett described it as wicked, and iconic baseball journalist Peter Gammons had previously ranked it as the 2nd best in the league. But for the 3rd time, Stieb shakes off his catcher. There's only one choice left. Petralli delivers the sign for a changeup. Tossed by Stieb only about once every 14 pitches to keep hitters off balance, it's meant to dupe them into thinking of fastballs coming, only to wind up hitting the radar gun in the 70s. Stieb coined it the dead fish, as its lack of velocity sorta just caused it to flop down late toward the dirt. Stieb's figuring Armas is sitting dead red expecting fastball and wants to leverage that. But even though this is just Petralli's 2nd career start and first time ever catching for Stieb, he knew what he was doing with his initial call for a fastball. Having previously competed against Armas in winter ball, Petralli knows that, especially when behind in the count, Armas loves sitting on the changeup. Oblivious to this, it also doesn't help matters when Stieb leaves the ball right over the middle of the plate, where one big swing from Armis sends it flying into the outfield bleachers, ripping both the no-hitter and the shutout from Stieb's grasp in one fell swoop.
The way he was pitching today, he really might have locked up this no-hitter if only he'd listened to his catcher. But Dave Stieb is a guy who, at this point in his career, feels like he knows everything. And frankly, if you know how he became a pitcher, and when he became a pitcher, it's hard to blame him. In college, Stieb was unquestionably the best player on the Southern Illinois Salukis roster. Thing was, he was strictly an outfielder. He broke the school record for home runs and hit close to 400, but he was not a pitcher, nor had he ever pitched at any point in high school. There's almost no precedent for this. Bob Lemon, one of the few who achieved no-hitter immortality, famously didn't even learn how to pitch until he was already a professional baseball player, but that was way back in the 1940s. This is the late 70s, the modern era, in which pitchers have at least some idea they're going to be a pitcher by the time they're 12. But here we have 20-year-old Dave Stieb, who's never even considered the possibility of pitching until one day in spring of 1978. Southern Illinois has a doubleheader coming up, and they're short on rested arms in the bullpen to the extent that they resort to desperate measures. They just round up all the outfielders and see who can throw the hardest. Turns out, it's Stieb. The pitching coach gives him a crash course on how to throw a slider, a pitch that typically takes years and years to master. Stieb gives it a couple tries in practice, and it immediately becomes clear that he has the best slider on the team. So they shove him out there to pitch a couple innings and fill a job that typically requires a decade of in-game experience. With literally zero in-game experience, Stieb sits down all 7 of the batters he faces. His slider is estimated at 89 miles per hour, with his fastball thought to be moving at 97. There were and are many major league pitchers who can't approach that velocity. Stieb had a missile launcher attached to his right shoulder, and he never even knew it. The time is ripe for shenanigans. A few scouts from Major League Baseball just happen to be attending this game, and Blue Jays scout Alamakia outmaneuvers all of them. He immediately sows doubt amongst scouts from other teams, saying that this outfielder just happened to look out on the mound against a bunch of stiffs and that he'd never be able to do it again. He doesn't know anything about conditioning, he hasn't built up arm strength or pitching instincts. Projecting him as a pitcher is ridiculous. It's a pretty strong case, and Lamakia's fellow scouts seem to buy it. He's duped them all. Lamakia picks up the phone and calls Toronto, and 2 months later, Dave Stieb is pitching in the Blue Jays farm system. His coaches at Southern Illinois wanted him to stick around for one more year. You know, spend just a little more time learning what being a pitcher is actually like, polish your repertoire, and improve your prospects in the draft. That's certainly the most reasonable path, but this is an early opportunity to get to know Dave Stieb. He does not compromise, wait, or even slow down, for better or for worse, ever. He doesn't want to be great. He's already internalized that he is great, and he simply needs the rest of the world to catch up with him. Entering the minor leagues is the most direct route to what he correctly believes is his destination as an ace starting pitcher in Major League Baseball. He pitched in his first ever game a couple of months ago. He was still, by his own admission, learning how to pitch. His appraisal of what he was capable of was completely absurd. He was also absolutely correct. In '79, he's promoted to AAA Syracuse. Halfway through that '79 season, the organization has seen enough and promotes him to the big league roster. And that's where he stays for good. 13 months after stepping on a mound for the first time in his life, Dave Stieb is a major league starter. No one does this. Let's take in the sample of all the rookie pitchers who first broke into the bigs in '79. In black, you see the number of innings they logged in the minors, and in white, you see how many major league innings they pitched in their first 5 seasons until they were sent back down, which in the vast majority of cases they were. It's typical for pitchers, even guys who end up as great pitchers, to bounce up and down a couple times while they develop. Not Stieb, whose innings pitched in his first 5 seasons are a huge outlier in this sample. Stieb spent just 128 innings in the minors. Now, these 5 guys, the only 5 who spent fewer innings in the minors than Stieb, it should be noted that while Stieb only pitched a couple of times in college, they had pitched all throughout college, and surely throughout high school as well. Surely all these other guys did, in fact. Look at all these others who toiled in the minors for hundreds and hundreds of innings, finally got their shot, and appeared in the bigs only briefly before being demoted. The depths of their lifetime pitching experience go far deeper than what we're seeing here. Imagine if these were trees we were looking at. What if you dug up the tallest tree in the woods and discovered the roots were only a foot deep? It just doesn't make any sense. Unless you choose to believe you are the master of the universe. That's the only real way to square it, I think, if you're Dave Stieb. And that is the thinking that leads you to blow a no-hitter by shaking off your catcher's signs 3 different times because you, and only you, have been right all along. But again, can't really blame him for feeling like he knows what nobody else does. See, in these early years, Stieb wasn't merely good enough to stick around. He was in fact one of the best pitchers in baseball. He knew this, but the people responsible for handing out awards did not.
For starters, these people struggled immensely to separate individual performance from team success. And while the extent to which team success should be weighed in an award like MVP is debatable, that's not really the case for MLB's most prestigious annual honor designated for pitchers, the Cy Young Award. It's an award that's supposed to simply go to the most outstanding pitcher in each league, but history is littered with outrageous Cy Young voting results, and arguably no one has gotten as consistently disrespected in that arena as Dave Stieb. Throughout his first 4 years in Toronto, the Blue Jays were the most dreadful team in MLB. As such, he had a much more difficult time than other pitchers in racking up individual wins, which is heavily reliant upon run support generated by the pitcher's teammates. For instance, when Stieb was called up to the bigs in '79, he joined a squad that would go on to drop over 2/3 of their games. Their 109 losses were the most by any team in the '70s, and the most any team would lose again for nearly a quarter century. And even if you do want to talk individual wins, the only reason the Jays were that good was because of this 22-year-old kid in the first full pitching season of his life who did still win half of his 16 decisions for the worst single-season baseball team of a generation. The next year he took a step forward, even earning a berth in the MLB All-Star Game. Perhaps he wasn't quite yet among the very top tier of the American League's pitchers. I suppose a forgivable offense given he'd been plying his new trade for about as long as one of Larry King's first few marriages, but that was starting to change. And even though that continued to change into 1981, the recognition did not. There are two names in particular that are pure embarrassments to have in lieu of Stieb here. One is Goose Gossage, who, as lovely as his rate metrics were, only had him thanks to pitching fewer than 50 innings. The other is Pete Vukovich, whose 3 more wins than Stieb thanks to the irrelevant to pitching superior run support he received from his playoff team, apparently way more than offsets the fact that Stieb pitched significantly more innings and had a significantly better ERA. Metrics that even back then they had at their disposal. It makes no sense. Let's make it make less sense. Welcome to the future.
Wins above replacement, or WAR for short. Has it enhanced our enjoyment of the game of baseball? Has it given us more bullshit to complain about? Absolutely. WAR is an estimation of how many more wins a team has because they have this guy on their team instead of some replacement level bozo. No offense intended toward any bozos who might be watching. There are a few variations of this metric, but we'll use the baseball reference model. WAR has been in the lab since the 1990s, but it didn't really gain traction until well after guys like Stieb retired. It offers a more complete picture of his accomplishments in retrospect. Now, the same things that make up ERA do factor heavily into this, but so do a lot of other things. How tough were the pitcher's opponents at that point in history? Did the pitcher's home stadium have particularly friendly or unfriendly dimensions? How well did the pitcher perform in more important, pivotal situations? Things like that. Of course, there's no one number that can ever give you the full measure of a player, and advanced metrics are in a constant state of evolution. 20 years from now, we'll probably use formulas that look a little bit different. But WAR is a pretty amazing metric, and it's the best tool we have to illustrate how great Dave Stieb really was.
With the benefit of hindsight and advanced metrics, we also see that Stieb's WAR more than doubled that of Vukovich. And despite again pitching for MLB's worst team, Stieb again was able to overcome that as he personally posted a winning record, even though that shouldn't matter here. Finally, in 1982, Stieb got the very first Cy Young votes of his career. Yet the results were just as perplexing as to how not one, not two, but 3 players could have finished ahead of the league's top workhorse who lapped the field in WAR, including nearly tripling Vukovich, who must know where all the bodies are buried or something, as this time he actually won the dang thing. Here's another way to frame what a travesty it was for Vukovich to win. In 1982, the average American League hitter had an OPS of 730, but specifically when facing Vukovic, that figure rose to 740. Folks collectively hit better than they usually did when facing the guy who'd ultimately win the award that's supposed to go to the most outstanding pitcher. That's not how this is supposed to work. I'm afraid it only gets uglier as we move into 1983. That year's starting pitcher in the All-Star game, Stieb was completely shut out in Cy Young voting. This despite having a better ERA than not only any of the 5 starting pitchers who did get votes, but also any AL pitcher who tossed at least 180 innings. And he had nearly 280, second most in the league. That helped catapult his WAR to heights that for the second year in a row towered over the rest of the league. And he wasn't even playing for a losing organization anymore. Stieb was the best player on a team that finished 16 games over 500, but Lamar Hoyt, thanks to the siren song of some more individual wins while playing for a division champ, took home the award despite finishing 3rd on his own team's starting rotation in WAR. And Stieb somehow received not even one single scrap of the leftover voting.
You know what's even more damning about all of this? These 28 riders all fill out a ranked ballot. They don't just vote for one guy, they're allowed a 1st, 2nd, and 3rd place vote. And in 1980, 81, and most egregiously 83, not a single one of those 28 voters could shake loose even one 3rd place vote for our buddy Dave. This sucks. Mel with this. Let's go to Disney World. Stieb is in an interesting spot. The likes of Andre Dawson and Gary Carter are royalty all throughout Quebec, of course, but in Ontario, the Prairies, and even parts of BC, the Toronto Blue Jays are by and large the team. And Stieb, being the Blue Jays' first true star, is the standard bearer who often has to do all the standard bearing things. One of those things is a promotional trip to Disney World. I want to show you this because I think it's important to at least see some version of Dave Stieb that isn't as told by baseball writers, who, by and large, do not like him. Here, he and his catcher, Ernie Witt, are flown down from actual Canada to the Epcot Center to take in a virtual Canada. Look, Dave, it's some land.
A lot of open land.
He's then whisked away to the American exhibit to virtually experience the magical land known as the United States, where he has lived his entire life and also is currently located.
Mr. Adams has not been prisoner in this lot for 17 days. I shall continue.
I'm so bored. I can only imagine how bored he must be, but look at that smile through gritted teeth. He's really trying. That's the thing to know. Yes, Stieb is often cranky, but he's trying to rise to the occasion of serving as a Canadian hero. He's working on it. Sometimes he fails. In particular, he has a frankly shitty habit of throwing his teammates under the bus when things don't go his way. In 1981, after left fielder Al Woods misplayed a ball and cost Stieb a couple of runs, Stieb threw a full-blown temper tantrum on the mound. Though it went unsaid, it's easy to guess that Stieb, who was a star outfielder himself just 3 years prior, didn't see what was all that hard about it. But showing up your teammates, the fielders who you as a pitcher rely upon to have your back, is one of baseball's cardinal offenses. It's something you just do not do. Unless you're Stieb, who stares daggers at Woods and even throws his glove in the air in exasperation. He'd been at it the whole inning, throwing fits after misplaced pitches and glaring at his fellow pitchers warming up in the bullpen as if to say, "Don't you dare come out here." It was such a spectacle that even his opponents took note, with Rangers manager Don Zimmer saying his behavior was total horseshit. The consensus is building very quickly throughout baseball that Dave Stieb is an asshole. Several incidents reinforce this image, including another fit in 1982 that nearly ended in a fistfight. After giving up a home run, Stieb blamed catcher Buck Martinez for calling the wrong pitch, throwing up his arms and cussing him out. As a pitcher, your catcher is your co-pilot. He's your only friend. Making the offense even more egregious, Martinez is one of the Blue Jays' elder statesmen, a respected veteran who's been catching since the 60s. It boiled over in the dugout, and even the next day, Martinez was looking for a fight. Stieb apologized, just as he'd apologized to Woods the year prior. He knew he'd messed up, but the cement has already dried on this reputation, and it's a reputation he'll always have trouble overcoming. Sports writers typically chalk this up to his hyper-competitive nature, and although Stieb absolutely was hyper-competitive, I think that explanation's too easy. There are plenty of monomaniacal athletes who manage to avoid taking it out on their teammates. I think this is more of a story of a man who did not tolerate limits. To get here, he marched right through those limits without hesitation, as though they were invisible. And amazingly, they were. The rule that said you couldn't start learning how to pitch until after your 20th birthday, not real. Did not exist. He hit the gas, rocketing right through the minor leagues, into the majors, into the role of number one starter, an all-star pitcher, and a 2-year masterclass evisceration of conventional wisdom. I mean, if you want to be exact, 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days. Now, Stieb was learning that the rules are, in fact, very real. They're just further down the pike than one might have expected. Stieb, a starting pitcher who only took the ball once every 4 or 5 games, couldn't will the Toronto Blue Jays into a winning ball club. He had zero influence over how much run support they gave him, and therefore how many wins he could stack up. That, in turn, resulted in him getting completely snubbed out of recognition in the form of the Cy Young Award. He should have won 2 at the bare minimum. In his own words, he was jobbed. With the benefit of advanced metrics he probably never could have imagined would come one day, we know his gut feeling was absolutely right. All of this fell into yet another domino. Money. Stieb wants $350,000 a year. The Blue Jays want to pay him $250,000, or about $700,000 in today's money, which is a ton of money, unless Stieb blows out his arm and he has to spread that $700K over the next 50 years or so, in which case $14,000 a year before both American and Canadian taxes would be his take from an all-star baseball career. That's not great for Dave and Patty, who recently married and are trying to start a family together. The move would be to hit the open market, but the rules prevent a player from entering free agency until he's played for 6 full seasons. For Stieb, who entered the bigs halfway through 1979, that realistically means waiting until after the 1985 season. So the move instead is to enter arbitration. Here's how arbitration works. Both Stieb and the Jays present their case to a judge who serves as an independent arbitrator. That judge then rules in favor of one number or the other, no in between. Since this is Dave Stieb we're talking about, he loses unfairly and has to settle for the $250K. He's stunned, and he also reveals something pretty interesting. He says the Blue Jays made the case that statistically he fell down the middle, that he was in fact a mediocre major league pitcher. Looking at modern metrics, that is an impossible conclusion to draw. So let's roll out some of the more basic stats they had access to at the time. How could the Jays have possibly argued that Stieb was mediocre? Not really in terms of ERA, in which he ranked 18th of 52 AL pitchers to qualify for the ERA title in '81, and that's not even counting the 150 or so others who couldn't stick around long enough to qualify. And definitely not in terms of innings pitched, in which he ranked 5th, which makes his earned run average all the more impressive. WHIP, or walks and hits per inning pitched, 7th best of 52. Strikeouts tied for 10th. Wins, the superficial stat that's a terrible reflection of actual value. Hey, even here he ranked 12th. We need an even dumber stat. The pitching wins even more useless son. Win-loss percentage. As a pitcher, you can pitch a great game and still earn the loss. Happens all the time. You can also parachute into a game, pitch 1 inning, and pick up a win if your offense happens to score at the right time. Win-loss percentage is beyond irrelevant. And yet, it's the only statistical category in which Stieb, who went 11-10, had a mediocre showing. This must have been the stat the Blue Jays cited. That's cute. If you're a pitcher who ranks well above average in every other category, how do you lose games? Poor run support. In 1981, the Blue Jays scored the very fewest runs in all of baseball by a decisive margin, even fewer than National League teams that didn't even get the designated hitter. Meaning, the Blue Jays leveraged their own incompetence to successfully argue that their best player was nothing special. This is some big-time loser behavior on the part of this organization, all for the sake of $100,000. They won, although they might not have if even one writer bothered to cast a vote that made him a Cy Young contender. That absence of logic is costing him money now. And you say he's cranky, huh? An Associated Press story laments that he just got too good, too fast. These rules that restrict free agency are in place to allow owners to do exactly this, to rob players of leverage. Stieb got here in the first place by rejecting every status quo, and of course, he rejects this one too, saying out loud what every player feels. From a distance, the inability of a player to determine which team he works for seems absurd, but even the ability to do so after 6 years of service was an enormous victory for baseball's labor movement. Just 12 years prior, Curt Flood had essentially sacrificed his career in his fight for free agency. In 1981, the players went on strike as a defensive maneuver, simply to preserve the sanctity of free agency that Flood had helped secure. It blew a hole right through the middle of the baseball season, leaving MLB to slap together a new playoff format and reschedule the All-Star game to August. A lot of fans saw it as a joke, and Stieb's role in these proceedings was to serve as the butt of the joke. American League manager Jim Frye mismanaged his roster so badly that night that he had to do something unthinkable in an All-Star game.
you're looking at another historical event. It's the first at bat in the major leagues for Dave Stieb.
Sending a pitcher to bat for himself, down by just a run in the bottom of the ninth. It was such an inconceivable outcome that Stieb hadn't even bothered to bring a Blue Jays batting helmet. So he suffered the extra indignity of wearing a borrowed Seattle Mariners helmet to the plate. This could have been avoided if the Blue Jays had a single batter good enough to make it to the All-Star game, but their lack thereof is pretty much the root of all Dave Stieb's problems, isn't it? The crowd boos ferociously.
Still got to get by Whitfield. Listen to the crowd. Well,
Dave doesn't deserve any of this,
It really isn't all
but it's
his
what he's
fault.
stuck with. For Stieb, baseball's labor conditions are a major get-in-line, pal kind of moment. The tough reality was that players' rights had to be won slowly, inch by inch, over the course of many decades. But patience is not a skill Stieb has had to develop, and the way of the world is something Stieb simply will not accept. So, if you will not accept playing for this salary, but you're not allowed to sign with another team, what do? Well, if you're Stieb's teammate, Danny Ainge, you could just quit, sign with the Boston Celtics, and play 14 seasons in the NBA. Sadly, not in the cards for Stieb. So, completely unable to enter free agency or negotiate with his employer, he hits the emergency button. Dave Stieb publicly demands to be traded. What we have here is a decent sample of 32 players who requested to trade around this time. Their reasons are usually at least understood by management. Some want to seek a different role elsewhere, for example, they don't want to be a backup. Some want to play closer to home so they can be near family. A few just aren't getting along personally. Finally, the question of money. The category Stieb finds himself in. Stieb and some veterans well into their 30s, a couple of whom are obvious Hall of Famers who have built up a career's worth of leverage and goodwill. Stieb is 24 years old. It's not as though being traded would magically grant him negotiating power with whatever new team he landed on. It's not as though the Blue Jays even have to act on his request. It's not even as though Stieb is asking to go to a team that wins him more games and puts him in better shape to win awards. He literally says he'll go anywhere. All this really did was earn the resentment of teammates and cause the press to sour on him further. To say the move backfired implies the possibility that it could have correctly fired. It was a no-win scenario for Stieb from the jump, one no other player's age ever attempted. Stieb had found a limit that stopped him cold, but hell if he wasn't at least gonna slam right into it. It was the only way he knew how to operate. Stieb does seem to channel his frustration in a productive way, though. In 1983, he puts together a season that's obviously magnificent to everyone besides the 28 writers who vote on it. The Jays, who finally seem to understand who they have in Stieb, lock him down with a 6-year deal worth up to $6 million. Things are good. Stieb is happy. And now, he gets back to work on his masterpiece. One he started a year ago, but couldn't complete.
It's May 30th. Stieb and the Blue Jays are in Detroit playing a pretty hot Tigers team that's won 7 of 9 with a batting average north of 300 in that time. But Stieb's not fazed. He enters his 12th start of the season with an ERA of just $1.51. He's in such a groove that just yesterday, Gammons wrote in a story about how Stieb doesn't even need to get a handle on opposing batters. It simply doesn't matter. He knows his stuff's too nasty and that he only needs to focus on maintaining that nastiness, which he certainly does early on, striking out each of the first 2 batters he faces and getting Larry Herndon, the one Tiger in their lineup who's hit him well in their couple past matchups, to ground out. By the end of the 4th inning, Stieb's worked through the heart of Detroit's lineup twice, and he's dominated the whole time in allowing nothing but 1 walk while striking out 7. He has now reached the 1983 equivalent of browser tab territory. Following a 1-2-3 5th inning, Stieb gets to face the bottom of the order to open the 6th. After Tom Brookins flies out, the caboose of Detroit's lineup strolls to the plate. There may be no easier out in the league than Tiger shortstop Julio Gonzalez, but Stieb makes his no-hit bid much harder for himself than it ought to be when, instead of cashing in what should be one of the gimmies on the arduous path to 27 outs, he issues a baffling walk. Nevertheless, Stieb recovers to induce another couple flyouts to keep his no-hitter intact. He's now only 3 innings away from becoming just the 2nd American League pitcher in 6 years to toss a no-no. But, for today anyway, that's where the magic runs out, with Herndon striking once again. 2 years in a row, he got 2/3 of the way to a no-hitter. The mountaintop was within sight. And it slipped through.
There's an unmistakable carnival game element to a no-hitter. It's probably part of what makes it so alluring, both for those of us who are trying to pitch one and for those of us watching. Throughout the 1980s, the cumulative batting average among American League hitters is .263, meaning a pitcher has about a 73.7% chance of getting a player out in a given at-bat. These are terrific odds, and they do a very good job of camouflaging the near impossibility of a no-hitter. For simplicity's sake, let's just suppose every batter presents that exact same success rate. Your chances of denying a hit of 2 batters in a row is about 54%, 3 is about 40%, and so on and so forth until your chances of keeping the first 10 batters hitless is a shade under 5%. As you can probably guess, it gets very grim from here. By this function, your chances of surviving 27 consecutive at-bats and allowing 0 hits stand at about 1/4%, or close to 1 in 3,800. And suddenly, it's not all that surprising that some of the very greatest pitchers of all time, guys like Pedro Martinez, Greg Maddux, Steve Carlton, have never completed a no-hitter. To start 3,800 games, they would have needed to keep themselves healthy and in game shape until they were about 150 years old. Pitchers like Stieb don't see it that way though. You can't afford to. In certain cases, the accurate math is not the best math to use. Rather than face the cold reality of this 73% evaporating into nothingness, you simply reset the table every single time a batter walks to the plate. There's no figure other than this one. There is no history. There's just you and him. That is not the most intellectually honest grasp of the matter at hand, but if you've ever played a scratch-off ticket, you know the any given game philosophy is the only one you can afford to have. Speaking of stupid games you cannot win,
the next season, Stieb continued ascending and continued being inexplicably overlooked when it came time to vote for the 1984 American League Cy Young winner. Not overlooked, however, were a couple of relief pitchers. Now, in general, I'm not really a fan of relievers who pitch far fewer innings than starters, getting a bunch of recognition for this award. Starting pitchers are far more valuable, and even at the time, with the information they had to work with, Stieb clearly should have been regarded as arguably the league's top starting pitcher. And despite barely losing out on the ERA title, one arbitrary scoring call may have single-handedly swung that. Heading into his penultimate start of the year on September 25th in Boston, Stieb was leading the league with an ERA of 2.56, nearly a quarter run better than second-place Mike Boddicker of the Orioles. But a flurry of singles in the 5th inning led to 6 unearned runs just in that frame. Stieb believes one of them should have been ruled an error, potentially rendering multiple of those runs unearned, but no dice. Instead, all of them being earned ballooned his ERA to 2.79, ultimately leading to an agonizing flip-flop with Boddicker and losing out on the ERA crown by 0.04 of a run. Yet Willie Hernandez, closer for a Tiger squad who was in a class of its own, is who won the award. Assessing WAR makes us realize Stieb popped even more, as for the 3rd consecutive season, the American League failed to produce any real peer for him. 3 straight years of a lonely Stieb residing in a stratosphere unto himself, yet never being more than a Cy Young afterthought.
Stieb and the Jays were such a perfect fit in this way. If an afterthought was a baseball team, it would be the Toronto Blue Jays of the late 70s and early 80s, who, despite their passionate fans in Canada, were thoroughly ignored in the United States. They weren't selected by NBC for a single game of the week, the premier baseball broadcast in America, until 1985, their 9th year of existence. Like Stieb, Jays fans grew a chip on their shoulder over a lack of recognition. And like Stieb, the Jays were secretly putting something together that was pretty special. If the Seattle Mariners were goofus, the Blue Jays, the other bluish team in a far-flung territory that was founded alongside them in 1977, were gallant. While the Mariners spent their first decade plus losing incessantly and just kind of waiting around for their savior to eventually show up and imbue them with some kind of reason to exist, the Blue Jays were busy. During their inevitable rough early seasons, they'd scouted and signed tons of talented players. 1985 is the first full season from shortstop and Blue Jays legend Tony Fernandez, who, as he demonstrates here, has a supernatural ability to rip down any baseball hit within his solar system. Filling out the outfield are Lloyd Moseby, a longtime friend of Stieb's, and Jesse Barfield, one of the iconic good guys of the sport. Once, when a teammate verbally abused reporter Susan Waldman for being a woman in the clubhouse, Barfield stood up for her when no one else around would, reaching out and asking her for an interview. That teammate was George Bell, a power hitter and eventual league MVP, and the only player I've ever seen charge the mound with a flying Street Fighter kick before running away and letting his teammates sort it out. Stieb also enjoyed a great supporting cast in the pitching rotation, including all-star Jimmy Key. But most importantly, they had a trio of incredible glasses guys in Jeff Burrows, Rance Mulliniks, and their terrific closer Tom Hankey, whose nickname was the Terminator, but who strikes me more as Krang's robot. The result was 3 consecutive winning seasons, the third of which puts the Blue Jays in the driver's seat. They're leading the American League East, ahead of the Yankees, Red Sox, Tigers, and all the other hallowed institutions that a Canadian team is not supposed to be better than. This is all arguably made possible because Toronto fans possess the patience that Stieb himself hasn't. While Stieb spent his early years banging his head against the wall over the Jays' inability to win ball games, the fans' love was unconditional. CBC journalist Martin O'Malley made a terrific observation.
They didn't have to be a winner. And Gillick, the vice president, and the people who shaped the team knew that. They could afford to be patient.
Since the fans showed up no matter what, those who ran the team knew they didn't have to win right away. They had the luxury of taking their time and slowly developing future stars. The fans of Toronto, I would argue, deserve a lot of the credit for this. Dave Stieb is in love with this city. He's waited for this day for years and years, and he was positive that it would come. Underlying his angry trade demand back in '82 was a distinct sadness over the thought that he wouldn't be here to see it. Maybe playing for a winning team will finally get Stieb the respect he deserves. Or maybe the powers that be need just a little extra nudge in the right direction. For some reason or another, baseball's regular flow of no-hitters had dried up. It used to be typical to see 3 or 4 every season, but not a single pitcher had thrown one as of August 24th of 1985.
Stieb brings a league-best ERA of 2.34 into Comiskey Park to face Tom Seaver and the Chicago White Sox, where throughout his career he's been even better. He absolutely loves pitching in this hallowed ballpark, and powered by a sparkling 1.33 ERA, the Jays have previously won 8 of his 9 career starts there. In this one, expecting the game to be delayed a while due to weather, Stieb has to hurriedly rush through his pre-game routine upon learning it ultimately is not. These circumstances certainly don't lead Stieb to think anything special could be afoot, but after 3 innings, he's dialed in, having only allowed a first-inning walk, and, thanks to an ensuing double play, has faced the minimum 9 batters so far. At this point, he glances up at the scoreboard where he sees nothing but zeros for the Sox and allows his first serious thoughts of a no-hitter to creep into his mind, even if he quickly tempers those thoughts. After he strikes out leadoff hitter Rudy Law to kick off the bottom of the 4th, Chicago's Brian Little tries to get aboard via bunt and actually reaches scoring position when Stieb fields it and rushes an errant throw to first that gets away for a 2-base error. But he recovers to strike out the next 2 White Sox, and when he doesn't allow a hit in the 5th, 6th, or 7th innings either, he can't help but allow those thoughts of a no-no to return in even more force.
This is not the time for this. Again, the Blue Jays have a 4-game lead over the Yankees in the playoff race with more than a month left in the season. In those terms, a no-hitter is just a win, nothing more. To hold him off, they must have Stieb's arm. An arm that, in the 1980s, is the most overtaxed arm in all of baseball. Between 80 and 85, Stieb has been the best pitcher in Major League Baseball. It really cannot be argued otherwise. A lot of his value, though, lies in the fact that he will have pitched more than 1,500 innings, a workload that, in future decades, will be thought of as irresponsible. And the consequences of those innings live in his elbow. He hasn't talked much about it, he just grits his teeth and pitches through it, but the pain's becoming so intense that, according to a report published just this morning, it's compromised his ability to throw his world-famous slider. Neither he nor the Jays understand how serious this arm trouble would become in the years ahead, and this grueling 9-inning gauntlet of the no-hitter is gonna do him no favors.
When he finally takes the mound for the bottom of the 8th, an easy 1-2-3 frame moves him to the brink of history. Stieb has plenty of time to sit with his thoughts, especially because no one else in the organization dares speak to him for fear of jinxing what he has brewing. Just 3 outs to go. But Stieb's overworked arm, which started tightening up back in the 6th inning, has progressed to a much more intense, debilitating pain all throughout his arm as he warms up for the 9th. Fighting through the agony with this golden opportunity right in front of him, and having gotten to this point by leaning exclusively on his fastball and slider without a single off-speed pitch thrown all day, Stieb's made up his mind that he'll try to muster as much heat as he can for the final outs. Law again leads off, and on the very first pitch of the frame, in footage quality you might mistake for that of a Bigfoot sighting, he takes Stieb deep to right. Once again, Stieb's lost a no-hitter and a shutout on a single swing of the bat. For 8 innings, there was never even the threat of a hit. Then he allows a homer to a guy who'd gone yard just 15 times in 2,183 prior career plate appearances, which is only about 1 in 146. Now Brian Little steps into the batter's box. Little's hit just 1 homer in 890 career plate appearances. That's about 1 in 890. Wanna guess what happens? Not just a homer, but an upper deck blast. Can't imagine many less prolific home run hitters having sent a bomb that deep. But that's just how shot Stieb's arm was. He didn't even put up a fight when the hook came immediately after. A dejected Ernie Witt, who so badly wanted the no-hitter for his battery mate, wanted to put the onus on himself, even though he simply called for what had been working all game and he and his pitcher were on the same page. To his credit, Stieb handled it well and had matured from his earlier years, but despite another brilliant start in another brilliant season, Stieb couldn't help but reflect on the potential domino effect of earlier events, such as the extra pitches he had to throw stemming from his error that contributed to his needle being on E for his fastballs to Law and Little. This is an all too familiar saga. After taking multiple previous no-hit bids into the 7th inning, and now taking this one into the 9th, at the very least, Dave Stieb has built up one hell of a callus to the heartbreak. He knows he'll make it back to the doorstep of immortality again, and next time, he's determined to kick that door down.
This game goes in the books as a win, one of 99 this season, enough to catapult the Toronto Blue Jays into the playoffs for the first time in their history. For Stieb, another gauntlet is ahead. This year, the American League Championship Series has been expanded from 5 games to 7, meaning their ace may have to pitch as many as 3 times in just 9 days. Working against the Blue Jays is that their ace is operating on fumes. Working in their favor is that he is Dave Stieb. If a team has the best quarterback in football, it wins. If a team has the best player in the NBA, it wins. If a team has the best pitcher in baseball, as the Blue Jays have arguably had in Dave Stieb throughout much of the 80s, it's anyone's guess. Individual baseball players are completely unable to assume superhero mode over the stretch of a 162-game schedule. Stieb's consistent greatness throughout these years was completely lost in the soup. The Jays' win-loss record offers no direct evidence that he was ever here. But for an ace starter like Stieb, this changes once baseball is bottled up into a 7-game playoff series. He will start up to 3 of them if necessary. The man who wants to be in command of everything, who wants to do it all himself, will finally experience the closest thing in baseball to it. Both Stieb and his partner in fate, Royals Game 1 starter Charlie Leibrandt, are arriving with some baggage. Leibrandt is looking to rebound from a devastating playoff loss the year prior, and Stieb is trying to engineer every last throw out of his tremendously overworked arm before it turns the rest of the way into oatmeal. Stieb's story, and it's already one hell of a story, is unknown to an American viewing public puzzled by the sudden emergence of a Canadian baseball team. He's never taken center stage like this before. They don't really know Dave Stieb. They will. In the top of the first of Game 1, Stieb first encounters Lonnie Smith. His story is a story for another time, but it's so spectacular that it's a wonder no one's ever made a movie about him. Stieb retires Smith and speedster Willie Wilson to face who he regards as his ultimate adversary, George Brett. Inarguably one of the greatest third basemen who's ever lived, and in 1985, he's the most dangerous hitter in the American League. By the time both careers are done, they'll have faced each other nearly 100 times. Neither ever really truly gets the upper hand on the other. In terms of OPS, Brett does just a little bit better against Stieb than the average batter. The two have a lot of respect for one another, with Stieb understanding that he can't beat the Royals without beating Brett. Every encounter is a brand new puzzle, he explains. You can't just throw him whatever worked last time. He's too smart. He also says something startlingly un-Stieb, that sometimes the best thing to do is admit defeat and move on to the next guy. Brett, for his part, knows that Stieb's mediocre one-loss record camouflages how dominant he actually is.
I'm going to tell you a little bit about the guy that's pitching against us tonight, Dave Stieb. His record 14-13 is very misleading.
The sports writers who give out awards, they care about wins and losses. Brett has a far more intelligent understanding of Stieb's greatness, and he uses that understanding to smack a double off the center field wall. Stieb escapes the first inning without taking damage, but Brett has sent a message early.
It's also worth noting that in the first playoff appearance of his career, Stieb, who's had the deck stacked against him all season, is seemingly dealt an additional blow. All year long, Toronto's bats have struggled against left-handed starting pitching, and not only is Stieb's counterpart the league's top lefty, but the Royals are also the league's only squad that boasts 3 southpaws in their rotation, and the only righty they're planning to start is Brett Saberhagen, a pitcher of Stieb's caliber. Here in the cauldron of the playoffs, it starts similarly, with a quiet first inning for Toronto, despite George Bell producing what has to be one of the very rare extra base hits stemming from a checked swing in baseball history. Stieb breezes through a 6-pitch 1-2-3 second inning, punctuated by Frank White not having a prayer as he whiffs at this nasty 0-2 slider. Just kidding. The real highlight of Stieb's brief time on the mound this inning was a fan who rushed the field to sneak a little lovin' onto him.
It should be known that our protagonist here, a little bit of a dreamboat. Canada loves him. Now Dave's a family man who's not interested in the advance, but he and the Jays later asked the police not to file charges.
Anyway, the Jays then buck multiple season-long trends in providing huge early support for Stieb, and doing so against Leibrandt, who on paper should theoretically be the pitcher they'd least want to face. In the bottom of the second, they score twice, and following another clean frame out of Stieb, the first 3 Jays reach base to load the bases and drive Leibrandt out of the game in the third. They all ultimately come around to score, giving Stieb the unfamiliar feeling of a big 5-run cushion. Brett gets another hit in the fourth, but Stieb continues to keep all the other Royals hitless, so nothing comes of it. After George Bell's leadoff single in the bottom half of the inning, he continues an incredibly audacious game of base running when he tries going first to third on a groundout. It pays huge dividends when a throw by KC first baseman Steve Balboni completely gets away from him and sails somewhere into Guelph as Bell winds up scoring on the play. Once the fifth rolls around, the game turns into a complete pitcher's duel for 3 innings with neither Stieb, who struck out 5 of the 9 batters, including a wicked backdoor slider on Brett that he called his pitch of the season, nor the Royals' Mark Gubicza allowing a hit. That ends in the 8th when Stieb finally allows his first hit to a Royal other than Brett, before immediately retiring the side on the next pitch and calling it a night. 8 of the 9 starting Royals couldn't touch Stieb. The only one who could recognized that this was simply par for the course, a typical Dave Stieb game. In the twilight of a 6-0 game, Kansas City tacks on a meaningless run, but Toronto cruises to a 1-0 ALCS lead thanks to the 8-inning, 8-strikeout, 3-hit, 0-run masterpiece pitched by Stieb in his and his team's playoff debut.
Now, Stieb has to do what he hates the most, sit around and wait. He watches a wild Game 2 from the bench. Starter Jimmy Key is knocked out early, and after several lead changes, the Jays find themselves down a run in the bottom of the 10th. when they call it a favor from their fellow birds.
And out in the outfield, the seagulls are getting very troublesome. They're lighting all over the field and getting in people's way.
A flock of seagulls descends upon the exhibition stadium outfield. In the wake of this stirring show of support, Al Oliver knocks in the game-winning run for the Jays.
The throw from Smith. The Blue Jays win it.
You know what? I can hear the doubters now. If they can use bird powers, why don't they do it every game? It's a special ability, okay? They have to charge their powers. They can't do it all the time. Don't speculate on matters you know nothing about. Anyway, having expired their mana, Doyle Alexander and the Jays fall in Game 3, thanks to a punishing performance in Kansas City from George Brett that goes home run, double, home run, single. On just 3 days rest, Stieb takes the hill in Game 4.
In another duel against Lee Brandt, the first inning sees Stieb very nearly blessed with a seemingly impossible second consecutive game of early run support against him when George Bell wallops an 0-1 fastball that covers about 409 and some change of the 410 feet to straightaway center in a ball that pretty much would have been gone anywhere else, but instead is just the longest possible out. Well, that stings, but the Jays' next inning starts off with a leadoff walk, and a Jesse Barfield double puts two in scoring position with none out. Most balls in play would score a run here, but 3 pitches and 2 shallow fly balls later, the runners remain where they are, and there are 2 down. After fielding a comebacker, Lee Brandt escapes from that huge jam completely unscathed. God forbid there be back-to-back games of early support for Stieb, who's continued to dominate. With 2 outs in the third, he gives up his very first hit of the game on a weak chopper, and hit should be in air quotes there, as he probably did just beat Willie Wilson to the bag. That call makes even the always mild-mannered Bobby Cox in a slightly unpleasant mood. Instead of being the third out, now Stieb has to pitch to Brett with a man on, but he remains unfazed, and a grounder to Tony Fernandez sends Game 4 into the 4th inning. Again, the baseball gods tantalize Stieb with the novel concept of his team scoring for him, this time with Cliff Johnson getting a hold of one that he definitely thinks is gone, only to be yet another long out at the very back of the warning track. For the next couple innings, Stieb sits down every Royal he faces, including this touchdown that he caps with a behind-the-back spike in the big football game, which draws pure venom from the crowd.
He hit a Pete Rose who spiked the ball for the goal.
In the 6th, Damaso Garcia's one-out double has the Jays in business. Next batter,
Line drive caught by Biancalana, and Garcia is in no man's land.
well, that business wasn't open very long. Finally, in his 14th inning of the ALCS, Stieb gets in his very first jam after he walks leadoff hitter Lonnie Smith before the first legitimate hit Stieb allows in the game puts runners on the corners with none out and the lethal George Brett due up. Following a mound visit, hands-down Pants Cox decides to intentionally walk Brett in the wake of his 11 total base gain. So let me restate the situation. With first base occupied and none out, Toronto's about to have their ace issue an intentional walk. This is unprecedented. Excluding instances when batters were representing irrelevant runs in the bottom of the 9th or extras, this is the very first no-out, first base occupied intentional walk in a playoff game. Stieb then gets up 0-2 on Hal McRae before tossing 4 straight balls to walk in a run that breaks the scoreless tie, much to his dirt-tossing dismay. It can all so easily unravel now. Despite pitching another gem, he's now losing and the bases are still juiced with none out. But like Lee Brandt in the 2nd, he masterfully works his way out of it with a pop-up on the next pitch, followed by an inning-ending double play.
They might get out of it. The Garcia, low throw, got it anyway.
When Stieb next takes the mound, he quickly records 2 outs before issuing back-to-back walks. He shoots a worrisome glance at the still with hands down Pants Cox, who begrudgingly removes them long enough to walk to the mound and remove Stieb, who for the millionth time in 1985 has pitched wonderfully with absolutely nothing to show for it. As he leaves the field and enters the dugout, some Royals fans say some stuff to Stieb. He's got a message right back for him. Since Stieb's gone from the game, that means it's cool for Toronto to score now, which they do with Lloyd Mosby's double giving Garcia a ride home and knocking Liebrandt from the game. A pop-up to Tony Fernandez puts the game to bed, and with a 3-1 series lead, moves the Toronto Blue Jays to the brink of winning the American League pennant.
In Game 5, with a chance to put the series away, Jimmy Key and the bullpen do their part, allowing just 2 runs. The Jays light up starter Danny Jackson with 8 hits, but somehow, none of them result in a run. In what must be an excruciating game for Stieb to sit through, the Royals shut him out to force Game 6. The Jays have to take care of business here. If they do, they'll be able to save Stieb's arm for Game 1 of the World Series and give him a little bit more rest. If they drop another game and Stieb has to drag himself out there for Game 7, in his words, I don't even want to think about it. But while the Jays do get to Mark Gubicza early, they ultimately strand even more runners than they did in Game 5, leaving 9 guys on base. Stieb just can't get a break.
Making his 3rd start in 9 days, the do-or-die Game 7 starts off with a Lonnie Smith base hit, but Stieb responds beautifully by immediately inducing a double play capped by fanning the mighty George Brett on a science fiction breaking ball. During Toronto's first turn at the dish, Willie Upshaw bats with a man on first and gets aboard himself on a liner up the middle that smacks right into Brett Saberhagen's bare right hand, which is kind of an important appendage for him to perform his job. Perhaps now lacking some control, he then plunks Al Oliver on the leg to load the bases, where, you guessed it, they strand everyone. In the second, Pat Sheridan reaches base on a well-placed bunt off Stieb and comes around to score on catcher Jim Sundberg's 2-out flare to right, giving KC a 1-0 lead. That, unsurprisingly, remains the score through 3 innings of this battle between 2 of the league's 3 best pitchers before Stieb allows a 4th-inning, wind-aided solo dinger to Sheridan, who pulls off the unique combo of bunting with the bases empty and homering on back-to-back plate appearances. After retiring the side, the Blue Jays no longer have to contend with Saberhagen, whose hand injury forces him from the game and brings in familiar foe and the league's other top 3 pitcher, Charlie Liebrandt. The first batter he sees is George Bell, who rips a double down the left field line. With a man in scoring position and none out, Toronto again fails to capitalize on yet another golden opportunity. Stieb keeps the deficit at 2, and the Jays again lead off the next inning with a hit which sets the table for Garth Orge to smash what is nearly a tying pinch hit homer, but over in left field the wind isn't nearly as impactful as in right, and it settles into Lonnie Smith's glove. They're able to at least come away with 1 thanks to Upshaw's double into right field, bringing Toronto within a single run of Kansas City as the game moves to the 6th inning. Stieb's command is clearly starting to wane as he issues 2 walks and hits a batter to load the bases with 2 outs. Bobby Cox is visibly concerned about the condition of Stieb's arm amid his massive workload, but after substantial deliberations, ultimately chooses to leave him in to face Jim Sundberg to get just 1 more out and escape the jam. But Sundberg's able to make contact on a 1-0 fastball that'd ordinarily be a routine pop fly to right, the exact spot where, instead, those heavy winds keep it sailing and plops precisely on the top of the fence before bouncing back into the field of play in what turns out to be a 3-run triple. This is an incredible relic. To this day, it remains the only bases-loaded triple ever hit by a catcher in MLB postseason history. But, with an assist from Mother Nature, the rarest possible event occurred at the worst possible time.
And that's the end of the season for Dave Stieb, and a few minutes later for his teammates too. Once up 3-1, they've blown it. Sundberg's batted ball is about half an inch away from grand slam. The fates, after robbing Dave Stieb blind, toss him a nickel. I learned then what it is to die a little. He'll soon write. The Royals end up winning the World Series in 1985, and their 21-year-old prodigy, Brett Saberhagen, takes home the Cy Young Award. Saberhagen was a deserving winner. For the first time in years, we can't honestly claim that Stieb was robbed. But he was just about as good as Saberhagen, and it's obvious that if Stieb hadn't been staked to a mediocre 14-13 record, the voters wouldn't have sat him all the way back here at the kids' table. It certainly also can't help matters that these voters are, of course, sports writers who regard Stieb as a jerk, which he often is, at least to them. Dave Stieb has an image problem, and in the 80s there are limited avenues outside of the press in which athletes can express themselves. You could write a book. You could record a supremely embarrassing rap video. No? Book it is. In 1986, Dave Stieb went and published his autobiography before his 30th birthday. But what have we been saying about this guy? What has he demonstrated time and time again? This was a guy who signed a pro contract as a pitcher with next to no pitching experience and figured he'd just learn how to pitch in the minors. A guy who showed up a veteran teammate with way more experience because he'd internalized that he just knew better. A guy who developed his skills so staggeringly quickly that he exposed the flaws in baseball's free agency system. And consequently, a guy who bucked every convention and became perhaps the youngest player ever to demand a trade for reasons related to money. He does not care about any timetable but his own. Given the results, why the hell would he? In case you're wondering whether it's unprecedented for a 29-year-old player to publish an autobiography, yeah, it kinda is. It's tough to track every memoir ever published by a ball player, but we're satisfied with this sample of 75 others. Most players drop their book well after they retired, often decades later. And of the few who did write them while they were playing, most are superstars, household names like Reggie Jackson or Cal Ripken. The only others bold enough to publish an autobiography in their 20s were digging at some superseding theme. Jim Pearsall wrote about his battles with mental health, and Josh Hamilton about his struggles with substance abuse. Dirk Hayhurst's book was less a conventional autobiography and more a window into what the life of a minor leaguer is like. If we remove those three and focus instead on the books that are fundamentally I'm a baseball guy and this is my story, Stieb is all by himself. What I find most fascinating about this book, though, is that it could have promised one of those unique angles. I mean, we can't shut up about the fact that Stieb didn't learn how to pitch until his 20s. It's absurd. That should be the sell. That should be the entire point of the book, but neither Stieb nor his co-author, Kevin Boland, really dwell on that much. It's mentioned, yes, but at no point does he even seem the least bit surprised by his cartoonish, Henry Rowengartner-esque ascent into baseball's top echelon. He just takes it as a given. He never once questions whether he belongs or what he deserves. Although this book was written many years too early, it's not too bad for what it is. Thanks in large part, I'm sure, to Boland, who's possibly the only writer Stieb likes talking to, there are some pretty fun flourishes. It's a short book, and there aren't any real bombshells in here, but he has a few genuinely interesting things to say. This is a man who knows he's kind of a dick sometimes, and he really is working on it. When he's wrong, he knows he's wrong, and he owns up and apologizes for it. The Dave Stieb of the mid-80s is trying to find the balance between allowing his competitive energy to burn him up and letting it extinguish. He wants to harvest the energy from that hum of the tens of thousands of people watching his every move, and pour it all into his arm without spilling a drop. He can't waste it. This turn of phrase is definitely Boland's, but the sentiment is Stieb's. Cast out the devils after all, and the angels just might go too. It's corny, whatever, I like it. Most profound is his introspection into why he is the way he is. If y'all would open your scripture please to page 150. He grew up as an outfielder, a hitter. You as the hitter are the active party. When the ball smacks into play, wherever it ends up, you were the one to put it there. That is the relationship with baseball he had always had. But Stieb, the relentless self-governor, the man intent on clearing a new path to greatness that no one had ever traveled and determining his own destiny, chose a profession in which your destination is out of your control. When you throw a pitch, you may as well put it in the mail. You'll load it up with what you think is the correct address and the proper postage, but the second it leaves your fingertips, you are almost always a spectator. Had he become used to this powerlessness at a younger age, he surely would have accepted it far easier. That right there, that's the story of all of this. All we've seen and all that's ahead. It's the story of a train conductor in search of a steering wheel. Gems like that one didn't appear to catch the attention of any of the writers who trashed the book, though. In fact, reading the reviews, I'm not entirely convinced they actually read it. One, which used more colorful language in the newspaper than Stieb ever did in his book, said it was full of complaints about his teammates, although anyone who read it would know that he told those stories in the process of apologizing and taking accountability for the way he acted. Another dismissed the title of the book, Tomorrow I'll Be Perfect, as arrogance. Whereas if you actually open the book, it's pretty clearly an admission that he's not perfect, either on the mound or toward other people, and a declaration that he is trying. One reviewer seems offended by the idea that they robbed him of the Cy Young Award in 1982. After all, says another, how does he think he's so great when he's never even won 20 games in a season? This shit again. Since it apparently bears repeating, the writers in fact did, and this is inarguable, rob him of the Cy Young Award in 1982, and maybe 1981, and definitely 1983, and definitely 1984. Just one of these would massively improve a pitcher's negotiating power. Stieb has lost tons in the way of future earnings because y'all don't understand numbers that have dots in them. Or, perhaps more likely, you do. But you're perfectly fine with abiding by the dumb prevailing wisdom of the time, the one that comically overemphasizes wins, because that's the logic that allows you to dismiss the accomplishments of our main man. He's often a standoffish jerk to the press, that's true. It's not nice, and there's certainly a chicken-egg debate to be had over whether the writer's ignorance toward Dave Stieb fueled his rude behavior toward them, or vice versa. But it's pretty easy to read what they write about his book and get the impression that quite a few of them have an axe to grind. They are gonna love 1986.
From the very outset of the season, it was clear that this wasn't quite the same guy who dominated the American League for over half a decade. Something was off. For instance, in 1985, Stieb allowed at least 5 earned runs in only 4 of 36 starts. But by the time he was just 10 starts into 1986, he'd already done so 7 times, which also happened to be the number that his ERA was approaching at that point in the year, while he was allowing a league-worst OPS of .960. For about the first third of the season, Stieb was turning every batter who faced him into 1999 Ken Griffey Jr. And it's pretty apparent the primary reason for his regression was because of the worsening physical condition of his right arm. He'd spent the offseason working on his changeup in anticipation of throwing it more often, and in the opinion of close observer and esteemed analyst Tony Kubek, this was likely due to the stress that his devastating slider placed on his arm. He had to reduce the frequency with which he threw it, and when he did, future teammate Joe Carter explained that it wasn't nearly as frightening as it used to be. It seems he was undoubtedly also feeling the effects of just how huge a workhorse he'd been for the Blue Jays for years, of how he'd pushed the limits in summoning every ounce of pitching magic that could possibly be extracted from a single arm, and of how he'd kept pushing himself beyond exhaustion, and plowing the unfamiliar ground of mediocrity while dealing with all sorts of persistent arm troubles that would ultimately be revealed to include bone chips in his arm. Stieb's crankiness and blaming of teammates seeped back to the surface. In one instance, he went as far as to suggest his presence on the mound was directly responsible for inferior defensive performances. It was just a miserable time all around for Dave Stieb. While he'd go on to settle down a bit as the year progressed, he finished up 1986 with extremely un-Stieb-like numbers as he entered a chapter of his career in which his body just would not cooperate to allow himself to compete at the level he was always accustomed to, which was the very pinnacle of American League pitching.
In his book, Stieb mentions some of the rivals he most admires: George Brett, Ricky Henderson, Wade Boggs. But a true adversary is beginning to emerge. Detroit Tigers starting pitcher Jack Morris, aka Black Jack, aka Mount Morris, was the supersized version of Stieb in every way. Slugger Kirk Gibson once called these two the 2 biggest babies in baseball history, but everything about Morris was bigger. His height, his uniform number, his ERA, his reputation as a jerk. There's one story in particular he'll never live down. This might sound familiar. When reporter Jennifer Fry approached him for comment in the locker room, he replied with some supremely misogynist horseshit, just because he could. It's a common defense in these situations to say that he was caught in a bad moment or something. Well, it must have been the longest moment of all time, because in the days that followed, not only did he sit totally content as his teammates and even the team president retaliated against her for reporting the incident, he actively made a point to swing back around and call her a word that I'm sure you can guess. This is the most important difference between these two, who at this point in history didn't yet have major beef with one another, but did trade a few barbs here and there. Look, when all this was going down, I was 3 years old. I was not there. I do not know these people. Only a small slice of what makes up a person is what makes the papers. Stieb was a little rude to the press at times, but I've tried to read everything I could find that's ever been written about him, and I find it impossible to believe that Dave Stieb would ever say anything like that. Left to right, innings pitched, up and down, ERA. On the diamond in the 80s, Stieb and Morris pitched more innings than anyone else in Major League Baseball, more than legendary figures such as Nolan Ryan, Fernando Valenzuela, and Bert Blyleven. When the pitcher of the 1980s debate is had, these are the two who are talked about. Up until 1985, Stieb was the better pitcher of the decade by miles. Over slightly more innings, he maintained an ERA that was more than half a run lower. Even after his brutal 1986, Stieb's body of work was clearly superior. This Z-axis represents pitching wins, of which Morris has significantly more than Stieb. To get them, your teammates have to score runs for you, which again is something you have no say in. Especially not in the American League, where you as a pitcher don't even get to bat. I'm going to do my best to play devil's advocate and defend this silly stat. There is something alluring about the idea of a pitcher going out there and taking full responsibility, win or lose, like a captain going down with the ship. To value the pitching win above all else, you have to believe that nothing matters besides winning. None of that egghead stuff. That is, in some sense, admirable. But it's also totally sentimental. If it's me and my money on the line, and I can pick any pitcher I want to start Game 1, I'm running straight back to those cold hard numbers and going with Dave Stieb without a second thought. This framing admittedly results in some gigantic omissions who arrived a little too late in the 80s to register in the top 10 here, such as Roger Clemens, who didn't show up till 84, and Dwight Gooden, whose godlike 1985 season damn near broke the world in half. So why is this the definition we've chosen? Because it's the definition Morris himself uses when he heads to salary arbitration. And I think we know which statistic he points to.
If Morris really wants to play the pitcher of the 80s card, fine. Let's play that card. We now know that Dave Stieb had a WAR of 38.5 after the 7 years that had been played. No other big leaguer was within 10 of that, and Morris resided outside the top 5 with a WAR barely cracking 24. We can isolate just those two for a year-by-year comparison of their progression, and the cushion is so big that even Stieb's 1986 from hell doesn't move the needle a whole lot for Morris. In terms of what could be looked at the time, 86 did bump Stieb's 80s ERA to 3.27. In other words, still an overall mark that Morris could best in a single season only once. I do not give a shit if Jack Morris had a few more wins per season.
Years earlier, when Stieb went to arbitration, his objectively correct argument that he was a statistically exceptional pitcher fell on deaf ears. He lost. Now, Morris uses caveman logic and not only wins, but racks up the single biggest arbitration win in baseball history. This is not a zero-sum type of deal, of course, the opposite in fact. Morris driving up the price for his services is good news for all pitchers, and he ended up in arbitration with the Tigers to begin with because, when he tested the open market, there were very suspiciously no takers for the top-tier starting pitcher. This served as strong evidence pointing toward a suspicion that was later exposed as fact, that baseball's owners had been colluding against the players. But lest we leave with the impression that Jack Morris was some kind of comrade, let's briefly visit the history of the split-finger fastball. This here's a four-seam fastball, but close enough. It's a little slower than a fastball, and it drops downward as it nears the plate, but crucially, the pitcher uses the same mechanics to throw it. He looks the same, so the batter isn't tipped off and doesn't know it's coming. We can trace the lineage back to pitching instructor Fred Martin, who championed the notoriously difficult-to-master pitch, but couldn't find any takers until he found his ultimate protege, future Hall of Famer Bruce Sutter. Sutter then turned around and taught this dark art to teammate Milt Wilcox. And years later, when Wilcox ended up in Detroit, he passed on this gift to Jack Morris, whose career benefited enormously from it. This is how baseball has always grown and evolved. Wisdom passed down from one generation to another, from one teammate to another, within one big shared camaraderie. It's through these selfless little acts that any sport becomes more and more beautiful with every generation that inherits it. In the early 90s, the veteran Morris is approached by a young pitcher named Pat Mahomes, who's trying to break into the bigs. Both, it should be noted, are in the Twins organization at this time, so they're on the same side. Mahomes builds his courage, goes up to Morris, and asks him if he can teach him how to throw the splitter. According to Mahomes, Morris responds, quote, "Get away from me, you little motherfucker." This is what Morris liked to do. Kick around people he could get away with kicking around because they were on a lesser standing. Every time you do that, though, you roll the dice. One time out of a million, one of them will be asked about any stories they want to tell after their son becomes a Super Bowl winning MVP quarterback. Tough shit there, buddy. At this time, Morris would have been about 35 years old, which is about 33 years too old to be acting like this. But I'm sure he wouldn't have acted like an asshole if he didn't want to end up as the villain in this story. For our purposes, he is Stieb's counterexample. He's the kind of guy Stieb might have become had he not put in the hard, unglamorous work of becoming a more mature, empathetic person. Our hero does not always succeed in this regard. He has his unflattering moments. But again, the point is, he's putting in the effort. He really is trying. And that, in itself, is a very real victory. In 1987, the Blue Jays continue their streak of winning seasons, to the point at which they've nearly broken even since Stieb got here. The trouble is with Stieb himself, who has another off year. Although he downplays it, the bone spur in his elbow, which causes a couple of his fingers to go numb, is pretty clearly a factor. It hurts like hell. But in true Stieb fashion, he postpones surgery to the offseason and resolves to pitch through the pain instead. Amid all the things he'd seen slip out of his control, his pitch placement was the one thing he'd always held dominion over. And now, even that was beginning to waver. Maybe that's why so many begin to notice a change in him. Teammates were startled by how nice he was becoming. One writer describes him as, quote, not an ogre, which is one of the nicest things they've ever said about him. It seems as though he's been forced to develop patience after having his abilities blunted at an alarming rate. It's either that or let it drive him crazy. This newfound patience is tested in September by Jays manager Jimmy Williams. Jimmy, Jimmy, 1M. When he was a kid, he started spelling it that way just to be different. So the man is a born tinkerer, and that's what he does with the biggest star the franchise has ever had. Near the end of the season, with Stieb's ERA hanging at a totally respectable 3.98, Williams yanks away the starting role Stieb has always had and reassigns him to the bullpen. Of course, it's Jimmy's decision to make. He and pitching coach Al Widmer aren't happy with his pitch selection, and he feels that with a playoff race underway, the team's better served with someone else in the rotation. Williams quickly reverses course and returns Stieb to the rotation after just 2 relief appearances, but for a pitcher like Stieb, even a brief demotion is a massive blow to the ego. Ultimately, the move is a fruitless one, as the Jays underachieve in '87 and miss the playoffs again. Early in 1988, the Sun publishes a reader poll asking whether the Blue Jays should fire Jimmy Williams. They do receive 1 no vote from local man Jimmy Williams. This is just not working out. During spring training, he's trying to make reigning league MVP George Bell his full-time designated hitter, which, given his poor fielding ability, makes sense. But Bell refuses. When the DH's turn to bat is announced to the crowd, he just sits there. Ultimately, Bell does get his way, and when he makes a critical and predictable throwing error in July, Williams immediately takes him out of the game as punishment. The two have a little bit of a meltdown in the dugout, rattling the chemistry of a team that's absolutely stacked with talent, and will now finish with a winning record for a 6th consecutive year, and just cannot put it all together. But there is good news. Dave Stieb is back. After postponing surgery, he finally had his bone spur removed prior to the '88 season, and his numbers are approaching what they were in the first half of the decade. Once again, he can throw his slider effectively and go directly after hitters rather than making do with what he's got and pitching around him. And while he won't catch Morris in the wins department, his ERA is comparable to that of the best high-volume pitchers of the decade. All this with an entire season left to go in the '80s. His greatest adventures were still ahead of him. It's August 11th in the Bronx, and Rickey Henderson, now on the Yankees, is being a real pain in the ass. He draws a leadoff walk from Stieb and then steals second and eventually finds his way home. Stieb avoids further damage, but in the 3rd inning, Rickey's at it again, getting on base and stealing second. It's enough to drive you crazy, but this is an older, more mature Dave Stieb, who can channel his frustrations productively rather than letting him eat him up. Jimmy Williams, the consummate meddler, walks out of the dugout. Uh-oh. You do not take Dave Stieb out of this game. You just don't. Not after just 2 innings and 1 run on the board. Over the course of his career to this point, he's been almost certain to stay in the game until at least the 5th, unless he was getting lit up, which today he's not. Just 1 earned run on 3 singles and 3 walks, a totally manageable situation. The only 2 comparable occasions came in 1981 when he was taken out after a line drive damn near blew his hand off, and in 1984 due to a rain delay. Further complicating the frustration of this is that for Stieb, there's a lot of money on the line. His agreement with the Jays stipulates that if he pitches 225 innings this season, he's guaranteed a 1990 salary of $1.4 million. He was in good shape to hit that mark until recently faltering. And while this likely hasn't entered Jimmy's calculus at all, denying him even a few innings deals Stieb a huge blow. Dave Stieb has grown a lot, but maturity is never completed. It's an internal, ongoing project, and sometimes there are more important things in life than maturity. Jimmy Williams continues his walk to the mound. In his book, Stieb described the humiliating pageantry of this prolonged public declaration of his failure. There is no ceremony in any other sport that quite compares with it for sheer embarrassment. Stieb kicks the mound and verbally unloads on Williams before making his exit. Presumably as punishment, for the second consecutive year, Williams demotes Stieb, his staff ace, to the bullpen. As before, Stieb only misses one start, but his odds of securing that salary are now doomed. Right after the game, he goes right back to that big red button. For the second time in his career, Stieb requests that the Blue Jays trade him. The tenor is different from last time though, when Stieb angrily demanded to be sent literally anyplace else. This time he's more careful with his words. He doesn't want to rake anybody over the coals. He doesn't even want to publicly criticize Jimmy Williams, as unhappy as he is with him, stressing that there's no bitterness between him and the matter is closed. Again, we see a man who is certainly not perfect, but we see the effort. Predictably, the Blue Jays elect not to trade Dave Stieb. He said at the time he made the request because he didn't have any recourse. But in one very specific, very real way, he did. If you need innings, badly, but your manager can end your day whenever he feels like it, what do? What's the one way you can seize control? What's the one game you could pitch that would render you so completely invincible for a day that no manager on earth would be brave enough to interfere?
On September 18th with Cleveland in town, Stieb's carrying a no-hitter while facing the minimum 9 batters into the 4th inning. This is the part of the game where the prospect of a no-hitter generally starts to register on the periphery of Stieb's radar. It gets broken up on a Julio Franco ground ball that finds its way into center field, but overall Stieb is dominant en route to a complete game 4-hit shutout. Flying high and at the top of his game, Stieb readies for his next start, a rematch in Cleveland on September 24th. Hanging by just a thread in the playoff race, the Blue Jays can't afford to drop any of their final 8 games, and Stieb rises to the occasion, holding Cleveland hitless while facing the minimum 9 batters heading into the 4th inning for the second consecutive timeout. Once again, he has to face Franco to lead off the 4th inning, and after a lengthy battle featuring 3 foul balls with 2 strikes, Stieb walks him.
There he goes again. Julio Franco entered the major leagues a few months before I was born, and when he played in his final professional baseball game, I was 32 years old. In between, the indestructible Franco played for 8 MLB teams in Mexico and Japan and South Korea, pretty much any place he could. Franco was a huge fan favorite wherever he went. He had this awesome batting stance, with his back elbow popped all the way up and his bat pointed directly at the pitcher. It's a stance 10-year-old me spent weeks trying to imitate until giving up because I couldn't use it to hit anything, but he sure could, in particular against Stieb. Of all the AL East hitters who saw Stieb on a regular basis, Franco was one of his toughest outs. Making it worse, Franco played second base, occupying a slot in the lineup where you'd usually expect to see a relatively harmless hitter.
That mini threat is immediately extinguished 1 pitch later on a double play to keep him facing the minimum, and after a 3-pitch strikeout of Joe Carter, Stieb carries a no-no into the 5th inning for the 11th time in his career. After retiring the next 6 batters, he's got one entering the 7th for the 4th time. Yet another 1-2-3 frame leaves him just 2 innings shy of permanently etching his name into no-hitter lore. Stieb's 8th inning begins with second baseman Manny Lee fielding a ground ball and recording an assist for the 3rd opposing batter in a row before the very first at-bat of the game against Stieb that results in something other than a strikeout or a routine out in the field. But 3rd baseman Kelly Gruber still makes a sensational play to preserve both Stieb's no-hit bid and having faced the minimum 23 batters through 7 2/3 innings. He loses the latter when he subsequently hits Luis Medina on a full count and has to pitch to pinch hitter Terry Francona, but retiring him keeps the former alive and well as the game moves into the 9th inning. I suppose at this point it seems reasonable to check in on Toronto's bats this game, especially given Stieb's lengthy history of outstanding pitching all being for naught. Alrighty, that seems about right. Making it even more excruciating is that the Jays had their chances. In the second inning, Jesse Barfield got thrown out at home, and in the seventh, after star first baseman Fred McGriff led off with a single and was bunted over to second, it happened again. Rick Leach lined a sharp single to the shallow outfield, and McGriff was waved home by third base coach John McLaren, where, for the second time, Toronto was nailed at the plate. And to pour salt on the wound, there was only one out, meaning had McGriff held up at third, he likely would have scored on any ensuing ball in play. I guess McLarens really aren't meant for stop signs. But, much like Lloyd Christmas, the Jays do get a chance to totally redeem themselves. McGriff again leads off with a nearly identical ground ball single up the middle, is again bunted over to second, and Leach again lines a sharp, shallow single. However, this time, McLaren does throw up the stop sign. When Rob Ducey hits a fly ball to center field, McGriff's able to easily score, finally providing Stieb a single run of support.
Stieb is shooting right through the keyhole. In terms of mathematical likelihood, we're entering the territory of 5% of 1%. He may only need to face 3 more batters to lock this thing up. He's been here before. His failed attempts litter his career like unfinished art projects. But he just keeps getting closer.
3 outs to go, Stieb fans his 8th batter to lead off the 9th inning. 2 outs to go. Up next is longtime ex-teammate Willie Upshaw, and he hits a bouncer toward Manny Lee, who for the 4th time in the last 6 balls in play off Stieb, smothers it up and makes the throw to first to retire the batter.
26 outs down, 1 to go. Julio Franco takes ball 1. If Dave Stieb were someone other than Dave Stieb, he might pitch around him a little bit, hope he chases something bad, and if not, the worst that happens is a walk, which keeps the no-hitter intact. But we know Dave Stieb too well for that, don't we? He goes right after Franco, putting one in the zone. Called strike 1. Again, called strike 2. Franco now fights to stay alive. He fouls off pitch number 4. He fouls off pitch number 5. He fouls off pitch number 6. He holds off on pitch number 7, which goes for a ball and pulls the count to 2-2. Stieb comes after him again with a pitch on the inside corner, and once again, Franco does not get a good piece of it. It squirts ahead, but well out of the reach of Stieb, who is now the spectator he wrote about. In perfect position to rope in this dud is second baseman Manny Lee, who's playing deep. It is here when Stieb has every reason to exhale, and Lee can scoop it up, throw to first, and put this thing in the history books. It is here when... This is not a bad hop. It's a fucking bloodbath. Manny Lee does every last thing his human body allows him to do, throwing himself into the sky to get his glove on it. He's powerless. Do you remember 1/10 of a second ago when this ball bounced in the infield grass right in front of him? And now falls well into the outfield grass. Base hit. If you were the baseball and you hated Dave Stieb and you knew how many times he'd been denied in every theater of baseball and you wanted to wait until the precise moment you would cause him the greatest misery with 2 outs and 2 strikes in the 9th inning of a no-hitter, isn't this exactly what you would decide to do? Watch it again at normal speed. I must repeat myself. This is not merely a bad hop. Bad hops happen once in a while. In those, the ball bounces in some way the fielder doesn't expect, and it hits the lip of his glove, or at worst in the chest, and even the face. In any event, the ball is knocked down, and Lee would still have enough time to collect himself, grab the ball, and throw Franco out. This one gathered every milligram of chaos it had within itself, to produce an arc that sailed perfectly out of the reach of Lee's outstretched glove. There are 2 theories we can present. Jimmy Williams, who despite his differences with Stieb is heartbroken for him, blames who should often be blamed for innumerable calamities, the Cleveland Browns. Just 5 nights prior, the Browns hosted the Colts on this field, and it's possible that 3 hours of football roughed up the dirt, creating optimal conditions for a bad hop. While a satisfying explanation, it doesn't seem like a likely one. Cleveland Municipal Stadium had also hosted the Jays a night earlier, meaning the grounds crew would have done maintenance several times over. More likely is that Julio Franco had inadvertently built a multi-stage rocket. Watch as he slaps the ball directly against the lip of the grass in front of him. If it lands just an inch short or an inch long, it lands cleanly on either the grass or the dirt, and it probably behaves like a normal grounder. But the lip of the grass does form an angle, however small, which I believe explains the oddly dramatic bounce. That bounce off the first lip of the grass is so precise as to seem engineered. It lands directly on the second lip of the grass. And having clearly demonstrated its ability to wildly alter a ground ball's trajectory just a split second prior, it does so again. A bat in Major League Baseball only caroms this cartoonishly if it smacks directly into some special topography, like the base or a pitcher's mound. Never an open space like this. Even if it didn't inflict itself upon the most important batted ball of Dave Stieb's entire life to this point, I would call it the worst bat hop I have ever seen. It was a moment of such abject sorrow that even Julio Franco himself feels awful. He wants to congratulate Stieb on a masterful game and shake his hand, but he knows Stieb well enough to know that he doesn't want anyone within 100 miles of him tonight. The next day, Franco marvels at how untouchable Stieb had been all game.
Best slider, best curveball, everything was perfect.
But then he continues and sounds like a guy who wants to disown himself of the hit entirely.
He deserves a no-hitter. I'll give him the credit. I don't think he should have broke a no-hitter like that. I was out.
If Franco could alter the history books, he would. But what remains is a no-hitter that was broken up with 2 outs and 2 strikes in the bottom of the 9th inning. No-hitters are notoriously difficult things to research. Fortunately, we benefit from some thoroughly impressive research from baseball writer Stu Thornley, who managed to track down every potential no-hitter in MLB history that was broken up in the 9th inning. He even managed to find the counts of balls, strikes, and outs at the time they were broken up. According to his findings, between 1988 and 2021, pitchers not named Dave Stieb have suffered the miserable fate of losing a no-hitter with 2 outs and 2 strikes in the 9th inning exactly 10 times. Within this same span, pitchers not named Dave Stieb have started 155,303 games, meaning that this happens to human beings not named Dave Stieb once every 15,530 starts. This is how many that is, and this, the very most heartbreaking of fates, is the one that just had to belong to Dave Stieb. Compounding this, of course, is not only that bad hop from another universe, but the fact that Stieb has been in pursuit of this no-hitter for years, falling just short every time. The last one so excruciating that he seemingly had to write a whole damn book just to exorcise the demons. But you know who we haven't heard from? The man himself. The next day, Stieb is asked about his immediate reaction to Franco's hit.
2 down in the 9th inning, 2 balls, 2 strikes, and Julio Franco, and he hits that ball to Manny Lee. What went through your mind there?
A younger Dave Stieb probably would have responded to this question so rudely that they wouldn't have even bothered airing it.
Well,
That you can repeat.
Well, it wasn't bad.
But this is a different Dave Stieb. One who can successfully bottle up his competitive energy and use it on the mound instead of taking it out on other people. Even that night, in the immediate wake of experiencing one of the most frustrating lost no-hitters of all time, he stuck around to talk to reporters. "It wasn't a bad feeling," he said. "I just had to laugh. Bad luck. Oh well." Thanks to his newfound hard-earned maturity, these things just don't eat him up like they used to. Rather than obsessing over what he lost, he could instead be happy with what was ultimately a fantastic complete game shutout. Times like these just can't keep him down anymore. It really was remarkable in its own right that Stieb even came close this many times. The vast majority of pitchers never get this close even once. Of course, the real heartbreak sets in once you realize how vastly unlikely it is that you'll ever get this close again. 6 days later. I swear to God, 6 days later, his very next start. Only Dave Stieb. I still can't believe it. Folks, there's just nobody else like him. Since the Jays have faded from playoff contention, this is Stieb's final start in 1988, so he's afforded the opportunity to focus solely on his quest for a no-hitter and burn whatever he's got left in the tank before resting up in the offseason. In front of him is a Baltimore lineup that, at first glance, is more imposing than the one he faced in Cleveland. In the heart of the order are power hitters and future Hall of Famers Cal Ripken Jr. and Eddie Murray. Past them, though, are a bunch of guys struggling to keep their batting average above 200, the bare minimum asked of any American League hitter. If there's any day to try for a no-hitter, it's today.
Plus, as an additional luxury, whereas Toronto hadn't gotten on the board until the 9th inning his last time out, in this one it takes the Jays all of 1 pitch before Tony Fernandez is standing on third base with a leadoff triple, and just 2 batters in, Kelly Gruber drives him in to give Stieb the early lead. Once again, it only takes facing the minimum 9 batters for him to make it through 3 hitless innings. Once again, the first batter of the 4th inning reaches base, this time via a hit by pitch, and once again Stieb erases that 1 pitch later on a double play. Another 4 up and 4 down, and by the middle of the 5th inning, he still hasn't allowed a hit to any of his 15 batters faced. He sits the O's down in order in the 6th, leading to his 5th career game with a no-hitter entering the 7th inning, where a 1-out walk represents another slight bit of turbulence, but Stieb personally smooths it out when he flashes the leather to make a nifty grab of a Cal Ripken broken bat liner for the inning-ending and minimum-preserving double play. Now just 6 outs away, the next 6 spots in Baltimore's lineup present only one dangerous bat, Eddie Murray. The 12-year vet came into the game with a career batting average of nearly 300 and is a bigger thorn in Stieb's side than just about any other batter he's ever faced, with 18 hits and 55 at-bats, good for an even better clip of 327. But for the 3rd time today, Murray's quietly retired, nothing but smooth sailing ahead. Quickly retiring the next 2 batters puts Stieb at just 78 pitches through 8 innings and the minimum 24 batters. Considering that in most of his starts he tosses well over 100 pitches, he should even still have a decent amount of gas left in the tank, as, for the 3rd time in his career, he sits just 3 outs from his sacred no-hitter. It only requires another 3 pitches before he gets Brady Anderson and Jeff Stone to ground out, the latter of which Stieb is able to handle himself, retaining some of that precious control and not relying on the fielders behind him. 26 batters in, 26 outs recorded. And then, there was one. For the Orioles' very last chance at the dish, manager Frank Robinson summons the struggling Jim Traber off the bench to pinch hit. Traber has had but a single hit in his last 27 at-bats, in the process dragging his batting average on the season down to .216.
Jim Traber will later author what is perhaps the first ever viral baseball video. It lit up dial-up modems from coast to coast, which is why there are about 12.5 pixels in the entire video. Here, in Japan while playing for the Kintetsu Buffaloes, Traber demonstrates the only real danger he presents to opposing pitchers. One of the many things that makes Japanese baseball so great is that when a batter charges the mound, the pitcher smartly just runs away. This pageantry ultimately ends with Traber diving unprovoked into, 7th or 8th base.
His greatest contribution of late has been in singing the previous night's national anthem, and now he steps into the batter's box as the lone impediment standing between Stieb and his crown jewel. After Franco's fateful hit came on a slider, Stieb's too scarred to go back to that well for the final out, and decides that he's gonna ride this out with his curveball. He starts him off with a couple sloppy ones to fall behind 2-0 before working the count even at 2-2. For the 2nd time in less than a week, Stieb sits 1 strike away from his no-hitter. After losing it in the most agonizing way possible, at the most agonizing moment possible in his last start, he had to wonder if he'd ever reach this close to the summit ever again. Not only has he's done so in his very next game. It's time to bring it home. After a foul ball, Stieb offers up another curveball down and in that jams Traber up as he bloops a soft flare toward shallow right field that lands just beyond the reach of the leaping Fred McGriff. For the 2nd time in about 143 hours, Dave Stieb failed to allow a single hit through 26 outs and 2 strikes of the 27 outs necessary for a no-hitter, and didn't record a no-hitter. He has no clue how Traber hit it. Traber doesn't really have a clue how Traber hit it. Orioles catcher Terry Kennedy doesn't have a clue how either play that busted up the no-hitters happened. But somehow, they did. Stieb regroups to get the final out on a ground ball to third, but becoming just the 2nd big leaguer in 44 years to pitch back-to-back one-hitters, something that to this day he's the only person to ever do while tangling with designated hitters in the opposing lineups, is of little consolation.
That one, he was strong enough to laugh off. This is too much. It's far too much. Slap some postage on this thing and ship it to hell. It has happened to him twice. The most personally devastating fashion in which a game can possibly end, with your would-be first ever no-hitter shattering into pieces with 2 outs and 2 strikes in the 9th inning, has happened to him twice. A fate that has only been experienced 10 other times over the course of more than 150,000 games has happened to him 2 games in a row. What are the odds? Well, you remember those odds of roughly 1 in 15,000. Imagine holding a pair of dice, each with 15,000 sides, and exactly one of those 15,000 sides painted red to signify the very saddest possible outcome. You roll them both, and both of them come up red. This is what Dave Stieb has done, and the mathematical odds of doing so are 1 in 241,190,218. 241 million is a quantity that's impossible to fully conceive of, but I think we owe it to the man to try. This is 1. This is 241 million. There's no way to make the assertion I'm about to make with very much confidence, but it's possible that what Dave Stieb has just experienced is the most impossibly unlikely outcome in the entire history of organized sports that has ever come to pass. 241 million, 1. He wrote his autobiography after losing 1 no-hitter in the 9th. Just 1. He just had no idea. He still doesn't.
The twilight of Dave Stieb's 1988 season didn't just feature those last 2 games when he threw back-to-back one-hitters. When looping in his third-to-last game of the season, you remember the first of the back-to-back Stieb starts in which Julio Franco crushed dreams of a no-hitter. Alongside those final 2, he pitched 3 consecutive complete game shutouts, an absolutely remarkable feat that's actually way more rare than a no-hitter historically. Though in classic Stieb fashion, on top of the lost no-nos thanks to luck straight out of hell, his spotlight further gets stolen as timing-wise this magnificent stretch of run prevention just has to perfectly coincide with Orel Hershiser's record run of 59 consecutive scoreless innings. But even Hershiser couldn't match what Stieb did with respect to one element. Stieb, who of course allowed just 1 single and ipso facto 1 total base in each of those final 2 starts of '88, also allowed just 3 singles and a double, which amounts to 5 total bases, in that anti-penultimate game. That gave him a grand total of 7 total bases allowed across back-to-back-to-back starts combined. In fact, of the other 138 instances since 1901 of a big leaguer tossing a complete game shutout in 3 straight games, the only other one to allow as few as 7 total bases was Bob Feller in early 1947. And considering Feller also reaped the benefits of the easy outs pitchers in opposing lineups represented, plus at the time was pitching in an American League that was not at all integrated and thereby didn't have to face many of the most talented hitters, one could easily argue that Stieb takes the all-time 3-game stretch crown.
You remember how he had a load of extra money coming to him if he pitched 225 innings in 1988? Thanks in part to his brief demotion to the bullpen, that became mathematically impossible. He surely knew that going into these final 3 starts. But he still pitched 3 9-inning complete game shutouts and got as close as he possibly could. Same story with his team. On the day Stieb made the first of those 3 starts, the Jays were 8.5 games back in the playoff race. Thanks in some part to his bulletproof performances, they caught fire down the stretch, winning nearly every single game ahead of him, and finished 2 games back. If Dave Stieb can't win, he doesn't lower his expectations. He simply finds a harder game to play. When he learned that his career prospects as an outfielder were less than optimal, he simply learned how to pitch at age 20. He signed with a franchise locked in a nosedive since the day it was founded, and when his request to be traded to a better team was fruitless, he simply bore down, threw until one of the bones in his arm began to deform, and helped drag him to playoff contention. Finding it difficult to string 2 sentences together for beat reporters, he turned around and wrote an entire book. When he clearly demonstrated that he was the best pitcher in baseball, but the voters ignored him year in and year out, he simply continued to assemble a body of work that might vault him over the annual prize and all the way into the Hall of Fame. Stieb was now most famous for his inability to wrap up a no-hitter. In 1988, everyone in baseball had gawked at the macabre spectacle of losing 2 of them in the space of a single week, both of them falling just 1 strike short. Forget the no-hitter. It was now time for Stieb to crank up the difficulty setting as high as it could go. What makes the possibility of a no-hitter conceivable is its tolerance of walks, errors, hit batsmen. Almost every no-hitter ever thrown has a couple of those. A perfect game, though, is inflexible past the point of unfairness. You must face 27 batters and get every single one of them out. No walks are allowed, not even an error is allowed. Your teammate flubs an easy ground ball? Sorry, perfect game over. There's a reason people talk about no-hitters a lot more than they talk about perfect games. As of the 1989 season, hundreds of no-hitters had been thrown throughout history, but only 10 are recognized as perfect games under modern rules. The first, appropriately enough, was Cy Young in 1904, followed by Addie Joss in 1908 and Charlie Robertson in 1922. And then more than 30 years passed without one, until the Yankees' Don Larson managed to throw one in the World Series. In the 60s, Sandy Koufax, Jim Bunning, and Catfish Hunter, all of whom ended up in the Hall of Fame. Len Barker, Mike Witt, and Tom Browning have managed to break through in the 1980s. And that, as of 1989, is it. Pitchers have started literally hundreds of thousands of games throughout Major League history. Exactly 10 were perfect games. At 7:39 p.m. Eastern Time, on August 4th, 1989, Dave Stieb begins his quest for number 11.
Stieb's got a date with the New York Yankees for his 4th career game in his new home ballpark, the 2-month-old Sky Dome, which he loves. He's allowed just 1 earned run in more than 18 innings across his 3 starts there so far, and now he's dealing in front of a packed house, having attracted the biggest crowd in the history of Toronto to witness number 4. He's also already had a spectacular outing this year in New York in his 2nd start of the season, where he tossed a 1-hitter for the 3rd time in 4 games dating back to the end of 1988, in the process becoming just the 2nd pitcher in 21 years to 1-hit the Yanks in the Bronx. Unfortunately for longtime teammate Jesse Barfield, that game's deuteragonist, he now has to experience Stieb from the other side after getting traded a few weeks later to those very Yankees for pitcher Al Leiter. New York enters this early August game swinging the bat well recently with a team batting average of .312 over their prior 10 games, and they employ another of Stieb's toughest outs, Don Mattingly, a former MVP who's made the last 6 All-Star games and enters the day batting nearly .400 across his 56 career at-bats against Stieb. And in the first inning, he does give the ball a good ride to deep center, one of 2 hit hard, but right to Lloyd Moseby, as it takes Stieb a bit to find his rhythm despite the 1-2-3 opening frame. But afterwards, it's pretty safe to say he's found it. Over the next 5 innings, during which the Jays actually managed to score a couple runs, not only does Stieb not allow any Yankee to reach base while striking out 7, but the baseball only travels beyond the confines of the infield once, with Mattingly hitting another liner caught by an outfielder. Still no one can find their way aboard, including ultra-threat Mattingly in what's potentially his final chance. Same story in the 8th inning, after which Stieb has faced 24 batters, and 24 times the batter was sent back to the dugout with his tail between his legs. So now he readies himself in his own dugout, having thrown just 73 pitches as he sets to enter the 9th inning, carrying not only a no-hitter for the 4th time, but he's also got that 11th all-time perfect game brewing.
When Cy Young threw the first recognized perfect game in 1904, the baseball world was astounded. It was an old sport even in that time, and they'd never seen anything like it. People did dream of science fiction then. They had big imaginations. They probably did imagine a man in another country performing on artificial grass beneath a state-of-the-art mechanical dome that opens and closes and controls the weather. But I doubt they thought so much of themselves and of their game that they dreamed of this man playing the exact same game, straining to achieve exactly what Cy Young did. As of 1989, 5 of the 7 who have ever thrown one and since retired have entered the Hall of Fame. That's what's on the table tonight. If Dave Stieb brings this the rest of the way home, he will be written about for as long as baseball is written about. Those other chapters will no longer be failures. They'll be prologues of his ultimate triumph. This isn't destiny. It's more than that. It's prophecy.
Leading off for the Yanks is pinch hitter Hal Morris, who's got just 4 hits and 29 career at-bats, and Stieb has little difficulty notching his 10th strikeout. Facing another pinch hitter, he has even less difficulty fanning Ken Phelps for number 11. Something previously done only 3 times in a perfect game, which Stieb is now officially on the doorstep of. 26 up, 26 down, never requiring spectacular defense to bail him out, and only once all game seeing a count to reach even 3 balls. Twice before, he was within a single out of a no-hitter, and the baseball gods prevented him from closing the deal both times. He has somehow again scaled 26 outs of that 27 out mountain. This time, all that stands in Stieb's way of actual perfection is Roberto Kelly, who brings up the rear of New York's lineup, but also isn't your typical number 9 hitter. Never before this year has an everyday player who primarily batted 9th batted better than around 300. Kelly entered this game batting .330 on the season and had 40 hits in his last 106 at-bats. But today, Stieb's required all of 6 pitches to strike him out twice. Both times thanks to his rejuvenated, trusty slider, which has been as devastating as ever. So is his curveball, having been a total revelation all game thanks to Stieb's pre-game whim to dabble with the angle of its delivery and then just carry that over into the game like it's nothing. And then just have it be completely unhittable and absolutely flummox batters. Yeah, that seems pretty normal. Now 1 out away, the record crowd is on their feet and delirious, showering the best player in the history of their beloved franchise with raucous screaming and cheering.
Exactly. Well, look at this.
They can taste it. Stieb can taste it. He starts Kelly off with a curveball that misses by the slimmest of margins, then throws another curve inside to fall behind 2-0. Stieb, wanting to end this thing here and now, then decides to go back to what... For his part, Kelly knew better than anyone how overwhelming Stieb's slider had been, and, with a 2-0 count, could afford to sit on it. Stieb recognized that issue, but still had no regrets about the pitch, which did exactly what he wanted, as it had all game with what was, according to Barfield, the wickedest slider he'd ever seen. Kelly just went out and got it. Perfect game, gone. No hitter, gone. But as Kelly stood on second, and with the tying run now at the plate, the crowd forgets all of that. They couldn't care less.
Standing ovation anyway, and he deserves it.
The nearly 50,000 people filling up the Skydome are all roaring with boundless pride and appreciation for their franchise's hero. As gut-wrenching as this all-too-familiar experience has been, Stieb's gotta gather himself, though he's clearly profoundly moved by the enormous outpour of love and support. Moments later, he gives up another hit to Steve Sachs that scores Kelly, costing him the shutout as well. But it is still a win in a season when the Jays will need just about every last one of them.
Stieb had already reached frustration's apex 11 months ago with that nightmare double feature 1 in 241 million occurrence. Now he's just exploring new dimensions of frustration. That's something he can bear to do now because the horrors of 1988 have granted him a kind of immunity. Nothing, not even a perfect game broken up after 26 outs, can possibly be as bad as what he's already experienced. All these failed no-hitters came in different flavors. In the no-hitter he lost to Tony Armas, he did so thanks to his own overconfidence. The Herndon game was the only real normal one, just broken up by a good hitter and a solid base hit. The 1985 game was busted up by a highly improbable home run by the light-hitting Rudy Law. In September of '88, it fell apart at the last second, via perhaps the worst bat hop ever caught on film. 6 days later, by what was, by the 222 hitter's own admission, a cheap little slap hit into no man's land. And now? Stieb comes within an inch of what is arguably the rarest and most difficult single-game achievement in all of sports. All of these have struck distinctly different notes. Yet again, it has to be emphasized that the vast majority of pitchers see their entire 10 or 15-year careers go by without experiencing even one game like any of these. Stieb has seen 6 of them. 7 years after he stepped right up for the first time, he sees this carnival game for what it is now. And he sounds like a man ready to let it go. If these last 3 attempts weren't good enough, he wasn't capable of producing anything that would be. "You really want me to try again?" I imagine he asks us like a tired dad at the county fair. "Look, I'm out of cash. It's getting late. But what the hell? You know what? What the hell?" 22 days later, the Jays host the Milwaukee Brewers. Their best power hitter is Rob Deere, who's my favorite kind of hitter, a guy who hits like .034 with 98 home runs and 400 strikeouts, but they're also fielding 2 future Hall of Famers in Paul Molitor and Robin Yount. These 2, coincidentally, are the 2 hitters Stieb encounters more than anyone else across his entire career. In aggregate, Stieb has kind of managed to bottle up Molitor, a really impressive feat against a guy who ranks 10th all-time in career hits. But Yount, who ranks 20th, is a different story. With a career .772 OPS, he actually does far better against Stieb. For whatever reason, he has Stieb's number. Just one of those things. And it's Yount who, after 5 2/3 no-hit innings from Stieb, reaches base on a batted ball toward third baseman Kelly Gruber. Gruber is a future Gold Glover and MVP candidate, but while he does manage to dive and knock the ball down, he can't get a good handle on it, and Yount makes it safely to first. If this is scored as an error, Stieb's no-hitter remains intact. Should it be? Gruber thinks so, feeling that any time a fielder gets his glove on the ball, he should be expected to make the play. In the moment, the official scorer, the parliamentarian of baseball, scores it as a hit. But Gruber holds out hope that the ruling might be changed retroactively, which is within the scorer's power to do and is not all that uncommon. Stieb keeps throwing gas in order to keep hopes alive. After recording the inning's third out, he sets him down in order in the 7th and issues nothing more than a couple walks the rest of the way. He's done all he can do. He walks off the mound with a 1-hitter that could become a no-hitter if the decision is reversed. Will the fates finally smile upon Dave Stieb? What, are you new here? A younger Stieb might have thrown a fit, but this one accepts the ruling without complaint. Being right-handed, his follow-through meant his back was turned to third base and he didn't see it. Once again, Stieb has discovered a way to lose a no-hitter unlike any of his that came before. Stieb says the same thing he said 3 weeks ago. He will not throw a no-hitter. No more chasing the carrot. The no-hitter is a cute little trinket, nothing more. After all, this game was a complete game shutout. Strictly in terms of giving your team the best chance to win, which the Blue Jays easily did today, this is the best job you can possibly do. This is the day he declares it to himself and to the world. He is not here to chase that needlessly specific statistical curiosity. He simply no longer cares. In fact, he actively does not want it. He's better off not wasting another second of his life worrying about it. In so doing, he claims another, greater victory today. One he surely never would have achieved had he actually had an ounce of luck on any of these days. The no-hitter stuff, it's noise. It's bar trivia bullshit. He is here to bring home wins for his team and for the city of Toronto. Full stop. The Blue Jays have now strung together 7 consecutive winning seasons, an outcome thought impossible in the wake of their early years, and no one player is as responsible for that as Dave Stieb. They've had very impressive rosters, top to bottom, but in 1989 they discovered the miracle worker they've always needed. The Jays began the season with manager Jimmy Williams barely hanging on to his job, and a disastrous 12-24 start finally did him in. His post is filled by the team's longtime hitting coach, Cito Gaston. In a welcome contrast from the incessantly tinkering Williams, Gaston offers a far more steady and easygoing presence. He is revered by the players, and originally doesn't even want the job until they practically beg him to take it. Stieb, for his part, loves the guy. The turnaround in '89 is one of the most instant and dramatic ever seen in baseball. Under Gaston, Toronto goes 77-49 the rest of the way, catching fire down the stretch and winning the American League East. The Blue Jays are back in the playoffs. Stieb's personal evolution has happened just in time. 4 years after giving every ounce he had in the playoffs, carrying the Jays on his back and falling just short in Game 7, he's once again penciled in as the Jays' Game 1 starter. Typically, a playoff series is defined by its pitchers, but this one is the story of Rickey Henderson, who, after a few years in the Bronx, has returned to Oakland just in time to beat the Blue Jays half to death. Stieb has waged countless battles with Rickey throughout the 1980s, but this time's different. There's really no other way to put it. In fall of 1989, Rickey Henderson is entering God mode. What we're about to see is an instance, and maybe the only instance in modern baseball history, of a single baseball player pulling his team to victory all by himself. It's something that Stieb, despite all his efforts, has found impossible. This is not a story about Dave Stieb, not primarily, but when we encounter something this spectacular, we have no choice. We have to stop the bus.
While Stieb's very excited to front a playoff rotation for a series kicking off near his home, there is no more unpleasant a way to start a baseball game than by facing Henderson, the greatest leadoff hitter ever. Each of Stieb's first 3 pitches miss as Rickey ultimately draws the leadoff walk. Advising him here is first base coach Dave McKay, sort of a Toronto folk hero back in the day as a native Canadian who also happened to be an original Blue Jay. He'll later spend time as Stieb's teammate and knows his tendencies very well. Because Rickey needs an additional advantage on the base path like a hyper toddler needs pixie sticks. Henderson's just 30 years old, but he's already established himself as MLB's preeminent base runner of all time, and having swiped 838 bags in the 80s, he fits snugly within a chart of the league's teams over that decade-long sample. 2 pitches into the next at-bat, whoop, there goes Rickey. Yeah, I'm not sure what took so long either. A Jose Canseco fly ball to center easily advances him to third before Stieb makes a nice play in the field to strand Henderson and escape the jam. When the 2 next square off in the 3rd inning, Henderson hits a grounder up the middle that only a marvelous play from Tony Fernandez prevents from being a hit, and in the 5th he smacks a ball, but right to Fred McGriff. It's after his next plate appearance against reliever Jim Acker, however, where we see quintessential Rickey. See, he's always been all about getting on base by any means necessary. For his career, he's done so on 40% of his plate appearances, thanks to a strong batting average of .290, drawing walks over 15% of the time, or, like he does here, taking a fastball to the wrist to load the bases in a game knotted at 3. The next pitch, Carney Lansford offers up a tailor-made inning-ending double play. Of course, that would be if not for this takeout slide of second baseman Nelson Liriano by a hard-charging Henderson that not only breaks up the DP, but also causes an errant throw that allows 2 runners into score as the A's take a 5-3 lead. Rickey played linebacker in high school, and that's exactly what he looked like in blowing up Liriano upon arriving at second base in the blink of an eye. With a big lead, a great jump, and world-class speed, Ricky did what Ricky and only Ricky can do. Generate a couple Ricky runs in what A's pitcher Dave Stewart noted was the play of the game. And he still isn't quite done yet. In the 8th inning, Henderson draws another walk before immediately stealing second. A wild pitch moves him to 3rd, and a base hit sends him home for Oakland's 7th and final run of their come-from-behind Game 1 win. With multiple walks, multiple stolen bases, a hit by pitch, and a 2-run double play breakup no one on the planet but him could make, Ricky had just produced what, for my money, is the most dominant offensive performance in a hitless game any baseball player has ever had in any baseball game. Facing Todd Stottlemyre in Game 2, he hits a sharp ground ball on the second pitch he sees toward perennial Gold Glover Tony Fernandez. Those defensive accolades are quite impressive and would be of extreme relevance if anyone but Ricky Henderson were flying down the first base line. He doesn't bat again until the 4th inning, where his patience again gets him aboard with his team down 1-0. After a bunch of throws over to first, Henderson swipes second. That's not enough. Off to 3rd we go. On the very next pitch, with an infield Ricky single-handedly dragged in, he set the table for a Carney Lansford hit to soar over Fernandez's head and trots home to score the game-tying run. Henderson's next at-bat, he merely drives a hit into left. A 3-run 6th inning by the A's removes a lot of the drama, but we're still treated to a final Ricky plate appearance, leading off the bottom of the 7th. This time it's David Wells who issues him a walk. This is the smirk of a man who knows he just gave up a 4-ball triple. It's just a formality. After some tosses to first, here's the stand-up, tiptoe dotting of the eye that doesn't even draw a throw, but does elicit much opposing ire. 49 seconds later, here is the crossing of the T. Round of applause for Ricky, who's become the first and to this day only big leaguer to ever steal 4 bases in a playoff game, before which that was the most stolen bases any American leaguer had ever had in any series. A Fred McGriff throw that hits Lansford clears the way for Henderson to head on home, giving the A's a 5-run lead that they hang on to as Ricky has once again been the spark plug for another Oakland win. Yep, that sounds about right, Todd. Game 3 shifts to Canada and begins with Henderson drawing his 5th walk in his 10th plate appearance of the series. Ricky's next turn at the dish comes in the 3rd, and he crushes a stand-up double down the left field line to reach base safely for his 8th consecutive plate appearance and 9th out of 11 overall this series. He spends about 53 seconds at second base. That is long enough. This man is antsy to get places and swipes his 7th bag in 21 innings. There he spends another 35 seconds before a base hit brings him home for the game's 2nd run. The Blue Jays rally to take a 1-run lead before Toronto finally manages to keep Ricky off the base path when he grounds out each of the next 2 times he bats. They then score another 3 runs in the 7th inning, and they only have to face Henderson once more, where another groundout ends the game as the Jays win to make it a 2-1 series. With Mike Flanagan on the mound for Toronto, the first pitch of Game 4 is a Henderson flyout. Within the context of this series, 4 consecutive plate appearances for him without reaching base actually constitutes a slump. So Ricky, who still hasn't reached the midpoint of his career yet has already hit more homers than any leadoff hitter who didn't sire the all-time home run king, rectifies that by clobbering a 2-1 fastball to straightaway center that lands about 430 feet later on the elevated, dark screen covered seats.
Out of here and into the black seats, the hitting background.
driving in the game's first 2 runs. Flanagan understandably didn't want to give Henderson a free pass, wanting to avoid at all costs having to pitch with Ricky on the base path. Mission accomplished, I guess. His mentality remains unchanged. He is at peace with the poison he has picked. True to his word, the next time he sees Henderson in the 5th inning, even with a man on second, first base open, and less than 2 out, a situation in which a walk would actually arguably be a desirable outcome for Toronto, he challenges him with a first pitch breaking ball right in the zone for strike 1. Then comes another breaking ball, which I think it's safe to say Ricky is ready for. His second 2-run homer off the netting of the left field foul pole and subsequent boogieing around the bases gives the A's a 4-run lead and chases Flanagan from the game. You just can't win with this guy. Toronto gets a brief respite from Ricky destruction when he grounds out to Tony Fernandez, and going into the 9th inning, they've cut their deficit to just 1. Henderson draws a 1-out walk and wants to score an insurance run. He's got his eye on stealing his 8th base of the series as... whoopsie daisy, Ricky's human, for a moment anyway. Ever the showman, he doffs his cap to the crowd as he returns to the dugout, internally spinning, getting picked off first to embrace the idea that for once he was simply giving the more than 50,000 nervous Jays fans there, to whom one could not have been playing the villain role more perfectly, what they so badly wanted to see. Unfortunately for the Jays, they failed to score in the bottom of the 9th and are now facing elimination on the wrong end of a 3-1 series. Toronto's very last hope in Game 5 lies on the right arm of Dave Stieb. Let's pick things up there where, oh hey, Ricky's already on base with a walk, and already stealing his single series record 8th base. Now in scoring position, he easily glides home on a Canseco single. His next at-bat in the 3rd inning comes with another man on second, first base open, less than 2-out scenario, and Stieb pragmatically starts him off with back-to-back balls out of the zone. But then the same man who issued leadoff painful walks to Ricky at the start of both Game 1 and this one, for some reason now becomes aggressive on pitch 3 in a scenario in which the damage from a walk would be minimized. But Stieb continues, giving Henderson another 3 pitches he can hit that he fouls off. He's playing with fire here, and even though on his next pitch he throws this slider outside, it ain't outside enough, and Ricky's able to reach out and drive it the opposite way into the right center gap where he flies around for the RBI triple. He just will not stop being mean to the Blue Jays. In the 6th, he lines a hard shot, but right at Tony Fernandez, and he mercifully grounds out with a 4-run lead the next inning. It doesn't really matter though. Toronto provides Stieb with 0 run support prior to his 7th inning exit, and the 3 they do score after that are 1 too few. The Jays' season ends and the A's win the pennant to advance to the World Series thanks to a series performance by Henderson that has never come close to being matched in baseball history before or since. Stemming from his 23 plate appearances, Ricky produced 15 total bases from his hits to go along with 7 walks, a hit by pitch, and 8 stolen bases. We can basically throw all of those in a bucket to say he directly conquered 31 bases, an average of 1.35 per plate appearance. That is galactically astounding. How galactically astounding? Glad you asked. As of 2022, there had been over 2,600 all-time instances of a big leaguer batting at least 20 times in a playoff series. Ricky's 1.35 mark not only places him atop the throne here with no one else close, but before 1989, only Reggie Jackson in the 77 World Series had reached 1.2. Over the first 32 years following 1989, only Nelson Cruz in the 2011 ALCS hit that 1.2 mark. And even in a series in which Henderson filled up the box score to an unprecedented degree, Ricky's best moment from the series wasn't even reflected there, but rather was his Game 1 slide into second that created 2 runs out of thin air. In their World Series sweep over the Giants, his 21 plate appearances produced 22 bases conquered, represented by this dot. In other words, his lesser 1989 series still resides above 99.1% of all the other dots here. An Oakland native, Ricky had attended as a spectator some A's games during their playoff run the prior year that culminated with a bitterly disappointing World Series loss to the underdog Dodgers. He knew right then and there that he could be the missing piece that had put him over the top. His ensuing serendipitous midseason trade back to Oakland gave him the chance to prove that no one has ever been more right about anything.
What other batter has ever had a playoff series this destructive? Ever? I mean, if you've got a different answer, he's in here somewhere. What this chart can't tell you is that Ricky not only destroyed the Blue Jays, he hurt their feelings. Cito Gaston, a former roommate of Hank Aaron's who'd seen as much baseball as anybody, had never seen anything like this. After just 2 games of this shit, he threw up his arms and supposed that maybe they'd be better off just letting him have second base for free, just to save themselves the torment. Fuck Ricky Henderson, catcher Ernie Witt said of his perceived hot dogging. He's a great player, but fuck Ricky Henderson. Ricky, who on top of all his gifts is a master of the art of trolling, replies, clarification, I don't run on you, I run on the pitcher. Base stealing is a very advanced science you wouldn't understand. Don't worry, Ernie, you're not special. I'm just better than all of you, that's all. After further accusations of hot dogging, which was sort of the buzzword of this series, Ricky dropped his magnum opus. You know, it's really sad that you can't hot dog. If you were great like me, you could do that too. What a shame. The Blue Jays had run into the only player ever to go full supernova. On the field and off, he ate them all for breakfast. Stieb didn't have much to say about it, at least nothing that made the papers, but it's interesting to contrast Henderson's historically dominant handful of games with Stieb's just about a year prior. While Henderson's efforts captured everyone's attention and went down in history, Stieb's 3 consecutive complete game shutouts, arguably the very most impressive 3-game pitching sequence ever seen, aren't at all remembered now and even at the time weren't really recognized. In part because another guy's similarly incredible feat was happening at the same time, and in part because of, well, you know. This is how it always goes for Dave Stieb. Through no fault of his own, his heroics have almost completely faded away over time. There are many reasons why it's faded, like the failure of the writers of his era to properly recognize his greatness and the consequences of playing in a foreign country. Another is that his career didn't last nearly as long as he'd hoped it would. That 1989 ALCS marks the last time Dave Stieb will ever pitch in the postseason. 1990, the season in which he turns just 33 years old, is the final full season he will ever play. On May 13th of this 1990 season in Detroit, Stieb will duel against his nemesis and counterpart, Jack Morris, one last time. With the 1980s in the books, the pitcher of the decade debate can finally be had in earnest, and Stieb has pretty clearly won. While Morris racked up a few more pitching wins and pitched a few more innings, Stieb's ERA that decade was about 35 ticks lower, and that gap is getting bigger. Entering this Sunday afternoon's game, Stieb has been cruising with an ERA of 2.15. Morris's ERA is sitting at a brutal 5.96, well over 3 runs higher. And 3 runs are the difference on the scoreboard today, with the Jays beating the Tigers 6-3. After the game, Morris stews over the box score. As is typical, Morris gave up more hits and more runs than Stieb, so he points to the only thing he can. Morris pitched 8 innings and change, whereas Stieb left the game after 6. Conclusion, according to Morris, Dave Stieb is a quitter. It's a really bizarre dig that there's just no need for. Morris has so much Stieb doesn't. He's made considerably more money despite not quite being a pitcher of Stieb's caliber. While Stieb will never pitch in a World Series, Morris has been there and won. While Stieb has suffered endless heartache in his quest for a no-hitter, Morris wrote his name in the Holy Book all the way back in 1984. But now that Morris is having a bad year, Stieb's the one he dumps on. And he doesn't stop at simply calling him a quitter. He says Stieb isn't the same guy anymore, implying that the pitcher who beat him is washed up. There's a thing called pride, Morris says, as though pride is something that he has and Stieb does not. These two men used to be two sides of the same coin. Arrogant, hostile, quick to pile blame on other people. If you've achieved the station in life they have, you can remain that way forever without consequence. It's the way the world works. It's entirely optional. Now, whether or not you think they would deserve praise for learning what most of us learned in kindergarten is up to you. But the record does indicate that one of them tried and one of them did not. Charlie Vincent of the Detroit Free Press, the Tigers' home paper, wrote that Morris had been blessed with a gift that many powerful people aren't. People in the room who aren't afraid to tell him to stop being such a dick. It seems it was a gift he ignored. Meanwhile, Stieb's evolution was noticed over the course of many years by, of all people, sports writers. A group of folks who he had completely alienated in his early years, and who sometimes pretty clearly had it out for him as a consequence. But even they marked his progress. He was reining in his temper. He was treating people with more respect. Even in those tough years when his skills were fading, years like the one Morris is experiencing now, he faced up to it instead of lashing out. According to Stieb himself, he didn't have to become a different person. He just had to grow up. When someone calls you a quitter, you do have to say something though. By this point, Stieb is plenty familiar with numerical obsessions, and he knows that fixating on complete games without regard to actual effectiveness is a game for rubes. Of course, growing up and growing older tend to go hand in hand. What Morris called quitting is really Stieb's ability to finally acknowledge his limits. The guy who used to throw fits over being pulled from a game is now concentrated solely on the success of the Blue Jays, even if that means admitting to himself that he has less in the tank at 33 than he did at 23. On August 17th in Minnesota, he does what a younger Stieb never would have done in a million years, and concedes that after just 6 innings, his team would be better off sending in a reliever. The curtain's on its way. Soon it's going to close on this phase of his life. In the next one, he'll be a building contractor, constructing houses in Nevada. Stucco, skylights, kitchen islands, walk-in closets. Nothing like this necropolis, this valley of monuments to his various imperfections. Some so improbable that they seem built by some ancient force. Time is running out. He has just enough of it left to present one more altar to the gods and say goodbye.
Thanks to actually getting some run support, Stieb's exclusive concentration on team success has worked out quite well when he's on the mound, as his 16-5 record so far is one of the league's best. Stieb starts the game off facing rookie Alex Cole, who's gotten a hit on a third of his 132 career at-bats. Dave pitches him carefully and puts him aboard with a walk before the dynamic base stealer tries unsuccessfully to take second. He walks Carlos Baerga before he's erased when caught trying to steal second. Then Stieb buckles down even further. After striking out the side in order in the third, he caps another 1-2-3 inning with a sharp breaking ball for strike 3 to end the fourth. Following another clean inning, he again strikes out the side in the sixth, including getting Tom Brookins on a slider that broke so hard he would have whiffed even if he'd been holding a paddle, as he now enters the 7th inning carrying a no-hitter for the 7th time in his career. Cleveland hasn't even come close to a hit, and in fact, Stieb's only allowed one ball to even reach the outfield to this point. That changes a bit when Dion James flies out to center to cap another perfect inning, and after walking Ken Phelps to lead off the 8th, the next 3 batters are able to send the ball beyond the infield, but still they simply drop harmlessly right into outfielder gloves. This sends Dave Stieb into the 9th inning with a no-hitter for the 5th time, with every evil force of nature imaginable preventing the completion of each and every one. Despite an onslaught of his opponent's best efforts at obnoxiousness, Cleveland's never even had a close call. Generally, and as Stieb points out on page 162 of his book, in most no-hitters, pitchers get a healthy dose of good luck in the form of outstanding plays in the field by teammates. But he's actually relied on awesome defense from a teammate to prevent a hit just once across all 5 of his no-hit bids that he took into the 9th inning combined. His pitching has transcended the need for the good luck that's so prevalent in other no-hitters throughout history. All he's ever needed is to not have atrocious luck. However, regardless of whether or not the baseball gods feel like bestowing more sinister luck upon our hero, getting these last 3 outs is going to be a daunting task based on his workload. Because whereas in his last 2 heartbreaking no-hit bids he hadn't even thrown 80 pitches by this point, he's currently thrown over 100. As he prepares himself in the dugout for another all-too-familiar final frame on the doorstep of history, Stieb is ready to once again push the limits of his right arm beyond exhaustion for his last real chance at immortality. With Brookins due up first and unable to bring something better than a paddle to the plate, he's lifted for usual starting DH Chris James to pinch hit, and he hits a routine can of corn to left. Next up is regular left fielder Candy Maldonado, and Stieb gets him chasing the high heat for out number 26. For the 4th time, he is 1 out away. Stieb wants no part of the hot-hitting Cole and walks him on 4 pitches. Up comes Jerry Brown, who looks at a ball and then a strike. Then, Stieb sends a 1-1 slider firing toward the plate.
He just can't say no to his slider. He never has. Even years ago, when it was one of the best sliders ever seen in baseball, he leaned too much on it. Years into the future, he'll lament that if only he could have reached for it a little less often, if only he shut down these games with his fastball instead, he would have had 3 no-hitters. A man with 3 no-hitters would be a legend. Everyone would know his name today. He'll also later describe this slider he throws to Jerry Brown as, quote, crappy. It moves, but not like it used to. It's missing that violent snap it used to have. It stays high, and unlike Julio Franco or Jim Traber, Brown gets every last piece of it. Stieb has made this turn too many times. His eyes track the ball, then move down to his right fielder, Junior Felix, and up again. And then he and we ride with him on this merry-go-round again. This is how the sport of baseball moves. Not at all, and then all at once, with such terrifying speed the lines begin to bend. And then not at all, perfectly into Felix's glove. Stieb first motions toward a fist pump, something modern and learned, quickly melts into something more ancient and universal. He's looking for someone. Even as his teammates mob him, he's looking further off. The arduous nature of a baseball season means that if you surprise yourself in the world with a no-hitter on a given day, your family will probably not be there, especially not on the road. Over the years, a different and unexpected sort of family forms around you. Stieb finds who he's looking for and raises a finger toward the one person in the building who can really, fully understand. To this day, entering the 2022 season, this remains the one and only no-hitter in Toronto Blue Jays history. It's suddenly clear that despite insisting otherwise, he never stopped wanting this. Not for a second. Can't shit a shitter, Dave. He really got it just in time, in the final month of the final full season he will ever play. But that was only one of his whales. Whether he can see him yet or not, the others are out there. For longer than a decade, the stories of Dave Stieb and the Toronto Blue Jays had been humming the same tune. In 1977, the Blue Jays were founded. In 1978, Stieb decided he would start learning how to pitch. Both rocketed to baseball's top echelon far sooner than anyone could have expected, catching everyone in America on their heels. Those in Canada just shrugged and said, "Where you been?" In 1991, the Jays were 9 years into what would ultimately become a streak of 11 consecutive winning seasons. Here's every team in the World Series era that's strung together at least 10. There's always been at least one active streak in any given year, and in nearly every year, multiple teams have had one going. The 70s, for example, had several, with the Red Sox, Orioles, Dodgers, and Reds consistently remaining a threat year in and year out. On only 2 occasions was there just a single team to bridge the gap: in 1915, when the Giants' era of dominance was interrupted by a single losing season, and in the years of 1989 and 1990 between the streaks of the Tigers and Braves. The Blue Jays, a team that had only existed for a decade and change, had somehow become baseball's model franchise. And as soon as it became apparent that the Blue Jays were becoming a good baseball team, they struck terror into the hearts of some American sports writers, who were worried Canada is too cold in the fall for World Series baseball. But now that the Jays have gone and built themselves a climate-controlled spaceship, they can't even complain about that. In '91, the table is all set for Dave Stieb, thanks in large part to manager Cito Gaston. He's done it again. After completely turning things around in '89 and barely missing the playoffs in 1990, he and the Blue Jays cruised to the AL East title in '91. It's a mix of old and new in Toronto, as they still have the likes of Kelly Gruber, Jimmy Key, and legendary glasses guys Tom Hankey and Rance Mulliniks. But they're also seeing the emergence of homegrown talent John Olerud, who will eventually become the American League's best hitter for a time. They've also acquired former foe Joe Carter, as well as Roberto Alomar, who not only plays in the Sky Dome, but lives inside of it like some kind of habit trail, often going days and days without ever stepping outside because he's decided that building a life of his own is just too much trouble. Those gusts of wind that blew through Exhibition Stadium, like the one that ended Stieb's season in the '85 ALCS, would now be neutralized by that dome. Thanks to Oakland's pitching falling apart this season, they won't be haunted by Ricky Henderson. Waiting for the Jays in the American League Championship Series are the Minnesota Twins, and in Game 1, the Twins will trot out their newest star acquisition. Dave Stieb versus Jack Morris. It's too perfect. The stage is perfectly set for these two titans nearing the ends of their careers to settle the score for good. But again, it's too perfect. Stieb was pitching really well this season until May 22nd in Oakland. A freak play unfolded in the first inning. With Stieb rushing over to cover first base, the base runner inadvertently ran right into him and bowled him over. Stieb remained in the game for a few more innings, but something was not right. That something was a herniated disc in his back. That bone spur, as painful as it was something he could pitch through by force of will. With a back injury like this, it's completely impossible. All the lessons he's learned about what he can and can't control, all the times he's barreled himself into limits he couldn't knock down, might make this a little easier to accept, but only a little. It eventually becomes clear he will not be able to pitch again in '91. On the plane back to his family in California, the pain is so debilitating that he can't even sit upright in his seat. They squeeze him under the movie screen, where he lays down the entire flight. As the season progresses, it becomes clear that this team is set up for a World Series run. Stieb admits that after more than a decade of falling short, it would kill him not to take the mound once they finally got there. But hell if he won't at least be there for it. Toward the end of the season, he rejoins the team from the bench, determined to wear the uniform that has defined him, or perhaps more accurately, the uniform he has defined. He's still in so much pain that someone has to help him put it on. Stieb's stand-in in Game 1 is mid-season acquisition Tom Candiotti. He's a fine pitcher, but he isn't Dave Stieb, who can do nothing but watch from the dugout and imagine how thoroughly he could dominate Jack Morris, if only his body would let him. Morris does Stieb a sort of backwards, accidental favor and spares him the bittersweet feeling of spectating his own team in the World Series. Morris wins both his starts in Games 1 and 4, and the Twins wrap it up in 5 games. He goes on to be named World Series MVP and picks up his second championship ring. Although a few of these guys were either before or after their primes, the 1992 Blue Jays boasted one of the most accomplished starting pitching staffs ever seen. Beyond Stieb, who'd recovered from back surgery in the offseason, they still had the similarly underappreciated Jimmy Key, reigning All-Star Juan Guzman, a future Cy Young candidate in David Wells, who would eventually complete a perfect game, future Cy Young Award winner Pat Hentgen, and just for good measure, future Cy Young winner David Cone. At this point, it surprised nobody that the Jays made it right back to the playoffs in '92. With a pitching staff this loaded, the only question for Toronto was who they were going to start in Game 1. Well, life's funny. Not only did the Jays acquire Stieb's arch-rival, they made him the highest paid player in the history of the franchise, and they awarded him the #1 slot in the rotation that pretty much had always belonged to Stieb. Everyone involved knew exactly what they were doing too. In fact, just a year prior, leading up to the '91 season, they initially pursued Morris before backing off because they were afraid of offending Stieb. Maybe now, given his recent injury, offending Stieb is something they feel like they can afford to do. You'd be forgiven for wondering whether the universe, having finally given up that no-hitter to Dave Stieb, was simply looking for a whole new way to piss him off. Surely this would expose Stieb's supposed transformation as a facade. Everyone has their limits, right? This is when he shuts out the media. This is when he demands a trade like he did those other times. But then something even more unexpected happens. Stieb does pick up the phone. He does talk to the media. And pretty clearly, without having spoken to Morris beforehand, he extends an olive branch to someone who's given him plenty of reason not to. He puts that old quitter comment in the past, saying that he doubts Morris really thinks he's a quitter, and even if he does, that's fine. How Stieb was really feeling about all this, who knows. Maybe he knew he had no cards left to play and raising hell wouldn't do any good. Or maybe as a matter of principle, raising hell was just something he was never gonna do. Maybe he had no interest in stooping to that level again. Morris remarkably responds in kind. Although, he can't get through it without making a very weird tangent and trashing some other guy who has absolutely nothing to do with any of this on his way out. Neither, as it turns out, is truly the team's ace in 1992. That honor goes to Juan Guzman, who threatens to push his ERA below 2 for much of the season before ultimately settling at an excellent 2.64. Despite very obviously being one of the top pitchers in the American League, he receives exactly 0 Cy Young votes. Welcome to Toronto. Meanwhile, Morris has a decent year. Stieb has an awful one. Entering his start on June 7th in Baltimore, his ERA is hovering a little bit over 4. He's run into some trouble in the 5th, facing Cal Ripken with 2 men on and 2 out. Stieb takes the early advantage, bringing the count to 1 ball and 2 strikes. His 4th pitch does exactly what he wants it to. Heading inside early, but then turning heel, curving dramatically back toward the plate and into the strike zone. Ripken doesn't swing, just as Stieb thought he wouldn't. Pitches like these, masterpieces Stieb used to throw without thinking twice about, are to be treasured now. They're acts of sorcery that the human body is absolutely not designed to perform. When it does over a long enough period of time, physical consequences arise, and tendinitis is the one Stieb is dealing with in '92. He'll later explain that after a certain number of pitches, the pain from simply flicking his wrist becomes incapacitating. Whether it's this ailment or any one of 1,000 others, whether it happens at age 35, 40, or even 45, it happens. The work that defines you, that you have engineered your entire life around, will be taken away from you. It's every athlete's cross to bear. Stieb begins to walk off the mound after what everyone appears to believe is an inning-ending strike 3. Plate umpire Ted Hendry calls ball 2. Stieb stops, plants his feet in the infield grass, and stares. He wrote his autobiography 7 years prior. It's safe to say he wrote it far too soon, but he did see the end with perfect clarity, from miles and miles off. He saw it late one night in 1985, sitting alone with his milk and cookies after his family had gone to bed. He was only 27 or 28, a young man with the worries of a man much older. When this ends, he resolves, it will be loud. This was not a passing observation. His dread of retirement is all over this book. On page 61, on page 18, when he frames retirement as just one of his 2 deaths and feels empty even thinking about it. On page 71, when he describes in anguish the injury he'll one day later have that robs him of all of this. He's haunted. It's something he can't imagine. Dave Stieb loses it. He verbally unloads on the umpire. When the Orioles use that blown call to light him up for 4 runs, he is pissed. After the game, ranting to a nearby security guard, he is pissed. In the weeks that follow, he is ashamed of himself. It was just the old Dave Stieb coming out one last time, and it was, in his words, the straw that broke the camel's back. His ERA this season balloons to nearly 6. Cito Gaston relocates him to the bullpen, an assignment he angrily protested just a few years prior, but now reluctantly accepts. His tendonitis intensifies, and in August he's shut down for the rest of the year, ending the worst season of his career. And for the second year running, Stieb does nothing but sit in the dugout and watch as his Blue Jays roll into the postseason again. The role of elder statesman is an increasingly odd one for Stieb. Usually leadership would be expected of someone with his tenure, but he doesn't believe a starting pitcher who often operates in solitude and only pitches every 5 games can be that kind of person. And of course, Stieb isn't pitching at all in the first place. He's just kinda there. When the Jays win the AL East and punch their ticket to the playoffs on October 3rd and the celebration gets going in the clubhouse, Stieb quietly steps out a little bit early. His inability to contribute to this team is hurt, and he probably simply feels that this victory isn't his to celebrate. Instead, he goes upstairs to the suite level of the Sky Dome to reminisce with Pat Gillick, the architect of this team. I think most of us would, in most circumstances, rather party with anybody but the Suits, but Gillick's the only one who's been here as long as Stieb has. The only other one who's experienced the Toronto Blue Jays transformation from hopeless cast-off expansion franchise to upstart to annual powerhouse, along the way butting heads with each other many times over and criticizing each other in the papers. And after all of it, they're still here. These two are more responsible for this success than anyone else. Although Stieb was only one player, playing a sport in which a single player's influence on team outcomes is considerably limited, it was through all the times he anchored the rotation, every pitch that made his arm feel like it was about to fall off his shoulder, that he brought legitimacy to this franchise. Legitimacy brought fans. Fans brought money. Money allowed them to prevent their developed stars from being poached by American teams and attract new stars from across the border. Some of Stieb's teammates downstairs might not realize how much of this he built, and how much they have to thank him for. When Stieb goes back down to the clubhouse, he finds that a few teammates, primarily 23-year-old rookie Derek Bell, have completely trashed his locker in retaliation for leaving the party. All of Stieb's things are soaking wet. They poured beer all over it. They'd used his locker as a garbage can. Even members of the press, many of whom still resented Stieb from the early years, are appalled that his own teammates would do something like that. It might not have been so bad had they not ruined all the pictures he kept of his kids. For as much as he dreaded the end, he probably didn't imagine it would be quite this lonely. Some Americans really didn't like the idea of a Canadian team winning a World Series, but we also claim basketball, which was invented by a Canadian, and we claim American football, which grew alongside Canadian football and borrowed some fundamental concepts from it. We also stole the Stanley Cup nearly 30 years ago and have never given it back, so this is only fair. After parading through the streets, the Blue Jays cruised back into the Sky Dome. Well, most of them. Interestingly, Derek Bell left his team and skipped the parade. But for the rest of them, a capacity crowd of fans was waiting. On this day, 44 people, mostly Blue Jays players, take the mic and address the crowd. Left to right, you see how long their speeches are. Up to down, you see how long of an ovation they receive. Or, in the case of the politicians who speak, who you see in red, the boos. All 3 of them are booed throughout because Canadians are ahead of us in the game and understood a long time ago that politicians should be booed all of the time. None of them get it worse than Ontario Premier Bob Rae, who was ferociously booed throughout his entire speech. He's really trying to all-right the crowd like an assistant principal at an assembly. That is a wrap for you, buddy. Get out of here. Of course, they love Dave Winfield, the heart and soul of this team, who delivered the series-winning double. And since he's the one to announce the dropping of the championship banner, he gets the longest ovation. Cito Gaston, unsurprisingly, gets a ton of love, as do Carter, Guzman, Olerud, and Pat Borders. One of the forgotten highlights comes courtesy of Mike McSudian, a guy who only made 3 plate appearances for the Blue Jays in his entire life and never got a single hit.
When we won the American League, I told him I was going to get a tattoo on my butt. I got it!
But did get a tattoo on his ass.
I gotta get one more for the World Series!
Aside from Winfield, who is the keynote speaker, the player who takes up the most time at the podium, by a wide margin, is Jack Morris. The undisputed king of putting on a hat, being out there a very long time, and not doing very much worth remembering. He caps off his speech by promising to recite a very special poem he wrote for his teammates.
I quoted a little poem for them in spring training.
Now just look at Juan Guzman in this moment. He's like, oh no, he's gonna do the poem. Oh no, please don't do the poem, for the love of God. Come on, Juan, you're being a little dramatic, right? It can't be that bad. Let's give him a shot.
The poem goes like this. Roses are red, violets are blue. The Twins were champs in 91, and the Jays are champs in 92.
Holy shit. And then, of course, we have our hero. Despite having a bad season and not appearing in the World Series at all,
Right-hander Dave Stieb.
Dave Stieb got one of the most enthusiastic ovations that day from Blue Jays fans who were well aware of all he'd done and all he'd meant.
What a day for this organization, what a day for Canada. And to be here 2 years that this team came into existence, and to have done all that I had done with the help of many, many teammates over the years, and to see this organization strive for this day from day one since I've been here. And if it were not for all these tremendous athletes on this stage right now, I might have never been able to be a part of this. I wish my family could be here right now to share this with me.
Stieb talks about something none of the other 43 speakers do. He talks about growth.
And this organization has grown. I think we have, as players have grown, and you as fans have grown.
For him, that's been the story.
And it's just so much growth, and it's so tremendous a day right now to experience this, to ride in that car, to see these people out on the streets. The support is tremendous.
He suffered some of the worst luck ever seen and endured excruciating physical pain, criminal underappreciation, and total disrespect.
And I thank each and every one of you for the support you've given me over the last couple of years when I've been down and out. And it's just been a great experience to see this kind of baseball the last 2 weeks.
The one and only constant has been his endless quest to better himself, however he knew how. His progress, like the progress of his beloved team, was jagged and imperfect, but steadily upward. He made it, and so did they.
I couldn't be happier for everybody here. It's just been a great day, and I thank you all.
A few minutes after this ceremony ends, the fans clear out, everyone goes home, and the Toronto Blue Jays buy out Dave Stieb and terminate the rest of his contract. During that victory celebration, several Blue Jays stated confidently that they would come back and win the World Series the next year too. Incredibly, despite dramatically overhauling their roster, they do. They have new heroes now. Jack Morris is now joined by more of Stieb's former rivals, Dave Stewart, Paul Molitor, even Rickey Henderson. And Dave Stieb has to watch him win this World Series from an even further distance than he did the last one. In the summer of 1993, Kevin Bolin travels to Buffalo to visit his old friend and co-author. The Chicago White Sox took a chance on Stieb earlier this season, but after Stieb got torched in all 4 of his appearances, they quickly ended the experiment. He's now trying to catch on with Kansas City, pitching for the minor league Omaha Royals, but his numbers are awful here as well. Having steamrolled through the minor leagues back in 1979, the soon-to-be 36-year-old is now finally paying the dues almost every other player has to pay. He doesn't need the money. This has always been true of Stieb, and it's true now. He must play every last card, exhaust every last possibility, test every single limit. So many times the world has told him no, and he's kept pushing until it gets his way or something breaks. This time's no different. He's even rediscovered that chip on his shoulder he used to have, thanks to a couple of cheap shots he took on the way out. In signing Jack Morris the year prior, the Jays had asked a whole lot of Stieb, but he let his wall down and welcomed his old rival with open arms. Well, this is what he ultimately gets for his trouble. Morris referring to Stieb as a, quote, disruptive influence the Blue Jays were better off without. He was living in the house Stieb had spent a decade building and kicking up his feet as though Stieb had never been there. Say this about Morris, he never pretended to be anything he wasn't. More surprising is the completely needless shot from his old GM, Pat Gillick. The two had always had a love-hate relationship, but Gillick's attitude toward him of late had been profoundly odd. This comeback attempt of Stieb's is a completely reasonable one. A guy who is still of playing age and who was an all-star just 3 years prior is simply giving it another shot and seeing what's left in the tank. But Gillick, in front of the whole baseball world, calls it sad. He says it's hopeless, that Stieb is spent. Seemingly without provocation, he's taken the best player in the history of his franchise and thrown him in the trash. There's no use trying to make sense of it. Stieb is trying to kindle this, to channel it into his craft and use it as fuel. He has dreams. They're not especially realistic, and he knows that, but they seem to keep him going. In one of them, he breaks into the bigs by September and joins up with his old friend and foe, George Brett. He makes one last ride into the postseason and pitches in a Royals-Blue Jays playoff series, once the stage of some of his greatest heroics. So many of his dreams, no matter how outrageous, have come to be. This one does not. Doesn't even come close. In August of 1993, Dave Stieb retires. And now, we wait. In his book, Stieb expressed that his first wish would simply be to play forever, but entering the Baseball Hall of Fame would be the next best thing. He watches the induction ceremony on TV every year. Even at this young age, he can smell it. None of his miracles have surprised him before, and neither would this one. We've spent quite a while reflecting on the tyranny of unfair rules, ignorant people, and good old-fashioned bad luck. All of that is nothing compared to what is ahead. You remember those 28 riders whose bewildering voting patterns caused endless frustration? Well, imagine if there were 500 of them. Here, I think, is the best introduction to the Baseball Hall of Fame. In 1936, the institution held its first ever election, meant to induct players who retired before 1900. After the baseball world held its breath in anticipation, officials announced that they had elected nobody. Yep, it's that kind of party. This happens even now. There have been a couple years recently in which they shuffled out there and said, sorry everybody, we're not electing anyone. All of the baseball players are bad. So here's how it works in Dave Stieb's time. If a player has been retired for 5 full years and that person is thought to be a possible Hall of Fame candidate, his name is placed on a ballot and sent to 500 or so members of the Baseball Writers Association of America, or BBWAA. Hey, I have a question. How do you pronounce it? Do you say it like bois? Something I've always wondered. Anyway, Stieb naturally will be a name significant enough to appear on the ballot in 1999. If he receives at least 75% of the votes, he enters the Hall of Fame. The good news is that he doesn't have to make it there on the first try. He'll be eligible to appear on the annual ballot as many as 15 times as long as he fulfills one important condition. He must never receive less than 5% of the vote. If he ever falls below this threshold, he's off the ballot for good. We're going to keep dancing with the one that brought us and stick with wins above replacement as the barometer here. Stieb retired in 1993 with a career WAR of 56.4. Quite a few voters do look closely at WAR, especially in 2022, but a lot of them only really care about the handful of more basic stats that are fed into the WAR machine. Different people have different ideas of what makes a Hall of Fame ballplayer, and that's fine. To an extent, anyway. We're about to show you the voting results of every player to appear on a ballot in the 21st century, and in so doing, we think it'll become very clear how much of a shit sandwich this can really be sometimes. It's cacophony. If they played music, it would be the worst music you have ever heard. First, let's visit all the players in the 21st century who the BBWAA voted in on the first ballot. Number 1, with a bullet, needs no further introduction. the slam dunk of all slam dunks, the guy who everyone knows is one of the best baseball players of all time. Even here though, quite a few voters invented a way to drop the ball. You can see that quite a few players received 98, 99, even 100% of the vote. Rickey Henderson received only 94.8%, meaning that somewhere around 25 voters didn't vote for him. Why? Well, some have completely fabricated complications for themselves out of thin air. They think that no player should be voted in unanimously, or that no player should be inducted on the first ballot. Never mind that this camp of weirdos is far too small to actually prevent that. Given the simple task of voting in the Hall of Famer who you already know should be in the Hall of Fame to the Hall of Fame, they find a way to foul it up. Now we move from the most fortunate to the least. Remember, you only remain eligible if you can break the 5% barrier on your first ballot. And the overwhelming majority of players do not. A good number of these players were universally understood to have no chance, and were really just put there on the ballot as a token of appreciation. But tragically, there have been quite a few who at least deserved further consideration and did not get it. We don't want to fall too far into the trap of allowing dots on a war chart to tell the whole story, but it is nonetheless pretty interesting that quite a few of the one and dones have numbers that rival or even beat a handful of first ballot Hall of Famers. But for any number of reasons, some good and some not, they just never got out of dry dock and were stricken from the ballot for good. Stieb doesn't really appear to belong to either of these camps, does he? He registers better than nearly every one and done player, but not as high as most of the first ballot Hall of Famers. His best bet, it seems, is to make a voyage. This is the small percentage of souls who've been left with no choice but to weather the open sea. They survived the 5% threshold, and their cases were often seaworthy enough to stay out here for 10 or 15 years. A few sailed to Cooperstown. Many did not. Again, war only tells part of the story for some of these guys, and there's no starker demonstration of this than the shared fate of Barry Bonds, far and away the best hitter of the last 50 years, and Roger Clemens, far and away the best pitcher of the last 50 years. Their performances on the ballot resemble smokestacks here, but you can read them as hourglasses. When Clemens first appeared on the ballot, his showing was a shade under 40%. He actually took a bit of a backslide in his second ballot, but then he regrouped and made steady gains. Unfortunately for him, as his hourglass began to run out, so did his momentum. Clemens landed on the ballot many years after Stieb did, and by this time the number of eligible years was reduced from 15 to 10. On his 10th and final ballot, he finished just 10 percentage points short. This is one of the only times the BBWAA voters have behaved consistently. The results of Barry Bonds are virtually identical to those of Clemens, and that's because the cases against both were basically the same. Not only were they alleged users of performance-enhancing drugs, some voters were troubled by serious personal character issues. Stieb doesn't have numbers like these guys because nobody does, but he also isn't troubled by either of those concerns in any way. In fact, he's firmly in the territory of the majority who have explored the open sea. No two of their vessels are alike. Larry Walker, arguably the greatest Canadian-born hitter ever, was egregiously undervalued when he first hit the ballot, barely surviving with a 10% mark. He languished in this territory for years. And then, with his time quickly running out, his supporters built him a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier. In his final year of eligibility, he just barely won the Hall of Fame plaque he deserved. That's one hell of a beautiful ship. Some are a lot less beautiful. Curt Schilling's boat looks like the car designed by Homer Simpson. It's all out of order. The various foul winds that plagued his candidacy blew him all up and down the sea. In his second to last year, the shore was in sight. And that's when Schilling, who was also waging an endless crusade against the media, asked the writers to leave him off the ballot entirely. They didn't, but they did bump him down quite a few notches. Curt, your boat looks like shit. Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa, once knighted as the saviors of Major League Baseball, saw the steroids issue actually push their candidacies backwards, almost off the map entirely. Lee Smith drifted all over the place as voters deliberated on what in the world to do with a relief pitcher, but by the time fellow reliever Trevor Hoffman came around, voters had answered that question, and they voted him in on the third try. The supporters of Stieb's old friend Fred McGriff suddenly showed up for him at the very end, but it wasn't even close to enough. Orel Hershiser, a superstar in a huge LA market and a model citizen with grand baseball accomplishments, barely made it out here at all. I mean, look at this mess. It's almost as though we're looking not at the ocean's surface, but the ocean floor. What is any of this supposed to tell us about where on this little blue line Stieb is going to find himself? Well, there are three important names to consider here. First, the plight of Lou Whitaker. Longtime Detroit teammates Alan Trammell and Lou Whitaker, one of the great dynamic duos of modern times. Though Trammell didn't make it to shore, he put up a valiant 15-year effort. Whitaker didn't even get that chance. No matter what happens to Stieb here, it won't be this unfortunate. Look at all those guys out there who accomplished about as much as Whitaker did statistically and immediately got voted in. Look at the ocean full of guys who made it in because they got the chance he did not. Why didn't he make it out of dry dock? Maybe because he had a lot of great seasons, but few absolutely dominant ones. Stieb has several of those, but Whitaker teaches us that there's a lot more to this than war. Stieb pitched his final full season at age 32. What would his career WAR have been like had he been physically able to pitch until age 40, as many others have? Who knows? Enter Kirby Puckett, an outstanding hitter whose career ended prematurely after his age 35 season when glaucoma suddenly impaired his eyesight. It was an outcome that obviously he could do absolutely nothing about. The writers recognized this, knew he was on track to finish with Hall of Fame numbers, and got him in on the first ballot. Now, we view vision loss a lot differently than we do a herniated disc and chronic tendonitis for good reason. The former is truly tragic, the latter just means you can't really play baseball anymore. But within the confines of this particular discussion, they're effectively the same. Stieb contracted tendonitis simply as a consequence of doing his job. It's not reasonable to assume he could have avoided it. And the fact that it shut down a guy who was no stranger to pitching through intense pain, having done so for years, should assure us that, although he tried his best, he could not have possibly pitched through it. Maybe in Stieb, the voters will see another player whose full potential was limited for reasons entirely beyond his control. And finally, let's take a look at Jack Morris, who was able to cruise for quite a while on his wins and reputation as a playoff ace. He built a battleship, but couldn't quite get the whole way there. Still, even with a WAR far south of Stieb's, he was able to remain in the conversation for all 15 years of his eligibility. Writers spent a decade and a half arguing and complaining and calling each other names over this dude. That degree of sunlight doesn't do a case like Morris's a whole lot of favors, but it does seem like it would do wonders for a guy like Stieb. If any body of work begs for further study, it's his. They don't even need to drop him out all that far. If the writers can just push his case into the water in the first place, it'll be as seaworthy as anybody's. Give him a few years. Let him all look over his dominant wins and all the gems he could have won if he had just a little bit more luck. Let him pull the tape and watch replays of that curveball that completely fell off the table, and the slider that on its own should be playing on eternal loop in some wing of the Hall of Fame somewhere. Let him build a little something. Of course, there is no telling. The waters are rough out there. So rough that you might wonder whether this entire process is worth investing any hope or emotions into in the first place. In fact, the results have sometimes been so aggravating that this attitude has come into vogue. Lots of people, myself included at times, have just thrown up their hands and declared the entire institution illegitimate. How can they expect us to care when the Hall of Fame voters can't even clearly define what it is, what it's for, or who it wants? I get it, I really do. I'm coming back around to care for one reason. These players care. These guys who spent years and years giving us things to cheer and yell and argue about, whose journeys and stories left us awestruck, who perform feats so astounding that sometimes you just want to sit and marvel at the fact that you belong to a species that is capable of that. These are people who, in their own brief and limited way, add just a little bit more vibrance to our world, and that building on that distant shore means everything to them. I think we can spare them just a little bit of optimism. This is ultimately, on a much larger scale, the problem Dave Stieb has always had. The ball is now out of his hands. God only knows what kind of bad hops may be out there waiting for him, but there's nothing he can do about any of them. The wait to 1999 begins. Stieb enjoys life in Nevada with his family. Up in Toronto, following their second World Series win, the Jays backslide, as teams always do. People come and go until almost everyone Stieb ever played with is gone. In '96, the walls between Stieb and his old team begin to come down, with Stieb showing up for some club events, and the Blue Jays making his name the very first on the Sky Dome's level of excellence. In 1978, the minor league Dunedin, Florida Blue Jays had a 20-year-old pitcher named Dave Stieb.
few years into retirement, there was a lingering itch of competition that Stieb developed a greater and greater desire to scratch. Sure, he enjoyed family time and playing his guitar, but there was just nothing else he could do to replicate that thrill of pitching. Despite the late start, the mound had still been his sanctuary for half his life. So in spring '98, Stieb decided to spend some time around the game helping out his beloved Blue Jays as a guest coach, messed around a bit in batting practice, and discovered both his body and his stuff had held up well. The Jays, also liking what they saw, embraced the idea of a potential comeback, and that was all Stieb needed. After a single-A stint in Dunedin, Stieb earned himself a triple-A promotion and pitched well there too. Well enough to attract the interest of the Texas Rangers in June, which compelled another promotion from Toronto to the Major League Club. Dave Stieb was officially back. After an astonishingly brief stint in the minors 19 years earlier before getting called up to the bigs, yet another rapid ascent to the top after little to no pitching in his recent past stunned Stieb. What he just pulled off has essentially never before been seen. Best we can tell, there have only been 4 other instances of a pitcher being anywhere near his 5th decade of life and reaching the bigs after at least 4 full seasons away from the game, and none of them were nearly as significant. There's Satchel Paige, who less than 10 months before blowing out 60 candles emerged from his antique bullpen rocking chair, stipulated by his contract due to being on the back 9 of life, to pitch 3 strong innings in 1965. Chief Bender was coaching the White Sox in 1925 when he hopped on the mound for an inning. There's Jim Bouton, one of the greatest pitchers in the entire history of the Seattle Pilots, who came back to spark fan interest and pitched 29 innings for the Braves in 1978 at age 39. And if we really expand our scope down to age 37, ex-pitcher turned broadcaster Dizzy Dean put his money where his mouth was after calling out Browns pitchers all year to cap their 1947 season with 4 shutout innings. Honorable mention to Jose Rijo, who, a few months after turning 36 in 2001, returned to the Reds following 5 elbow operations and 6 years out of the bigs in a moment so joyous it could only be rivaled by death. To come full circle, the debut of Stieb's age 40 renaissance would come in Baltimore, just like his initial age 21 debut. Hours after being activated,
Who's this? Dave Stieb!
Stieb closed out a 13-6 win with a scoreless 9th. Since he's been gone, the American League decided to play games against the National League, and his second outing back came in Atlanta, where, with a breaking ball that still gets guys fishing, he treated NL fans to his stuff for the first ever time. His 6-year Skydome hiatus came to an end 4 days later, and all he did was pitch 3 perfect innings, including fanning Ray Ordonez with a slider whose bite had gone absolutely nowhere to earn a standing ovation from the doting crowd.
Dave Stieb, a standing ovation in a 9-0 game.
Stieb went on to pitch over 50 innings in '98, meaning his comeback was far more meaningful and extensive than the others. That was because he actually proved he belonged. He didn't fare so hot in the 3 games he started, but in his 16 relief appearances he used to openly chafe at, he flourished. Granted, his sample of just under 35 innings out of the pen wasn't huge, but his ERA was 3.63, over a full run better than the average AL pitcher that season. And while the average AL hitter had an OPS of 771, against reliever Stieb, they mustered a mark of just 659, 19th best among the league's 77 pitchers to toss at least 30 relief innings. This was definitely not some farcical publicity stunt. After 5 years out of the game, and in his 40s, Dave Stieb not only clearly belonged in the big leagues, but he was a well above average relief pitcher.
Stieb's emergence at age 40 is such a startling reflection of his first emergence at age 20. Both were completely accidental. That college home run champ in 1978 was simply trying to help out his team, which had a depleted pitching staff and just needed warm bodies on the mound to make it through a doubleheader. He'd never pitched before and was just trying to throw enough strikes near the plate to avoid embarrassing himself. And yet somehow, with no experience and virtually no instruction, his mechanics were perfect. That was when he and a Toronto Blue Jays scout who just happened to be in the stands in Carbondale, Illinois that same day, discovered he'd been born to pitch all along. 20 years later, Stieb's ability to pitch is as settled of a matter as it could possibly be. This is a 40-year-old, about 5 years removed from a protracted comeback attempt that turned over every last rock and ultimately served to reveal in no uncertain terms how completely spent his arm was. He'd only shown up in spring training to chuck a few batting practice meatballs just so some rookies could say they'd batted against the once great Dave Stieb. But once again, out of nowhere, his arm came alive. In the grand scheme, the Dave Stieb of 1998 was simply a fairly effective pitcher who contributed 50 innings to a team that missed the playoffs, but he secured a number of personal victories in doing this. Of course, there's the one athletes always talk about, the one about going out on your own terms. This is of special importance to a guy like Stieb, who spent his entire career demanding full control of his destiny and rarely getting it. Whether it was poor run support, unfair labor conditions, ignored requests to be traded, perfectly assembled houses of cards that held together until a gust of wind blew him over at the very end, or his body refusing to continue, he was confronted with his ultimate powerlessness at every turn. Now, the decision is really, truly his. He's healthy, his arm's in good shape. The Jays have enough confidence in him to invite him back to spring training in 1999, which would be his age 42 season. He declines the offer and retires because, and only because, that is what he wants to do. That anguish he imagined as a younger man? Not there. At the same time, he's able to acknowledge his limits and live happily within them. A decade ago, he was agonized by multiple demotions to the bullpen. Here, it's the role that's best for him. He knows it. Just pulling on his uniform every day is a gift he's not taken for granted anymore. He's savoring it all because he knows how soon it'll end. Although he'd always loved baseball and lived for baseball, it wasn't always so clear whether he actually enjoyed baseball. He wrote in his book that he didn't want success on the mound, he needed it. And those do not sound like the words of a man who's having a very good time. Now, at the very end, he finally is. Stieb's final tour with Toronto has also allowed him to make amends with the franchise he helped to build. He'd previously been unceremoniously sent off with a couple of injury-aborted seasons, a locker trash by his teammates, and a couple of needless pot shots on the way out the door. There's just no way it could end like that. Not for the player more responsible for their ascent than anybody. Not for the guy who, in terms of wins above replacement, is to this day the greatest Toronto Blue Jay of all time. It's not even close. Not all franchises have a single player who stands above everybody else who put on their uniform, but the Blue Jays do. Stieb is their all-time leader, not only in the category of wins above replacement, where he towers over everyone here, but in innings pitched, strikeouts, and tied with Jimmy Key, ERA among starting pitchers. No current Blue Jay is anywhere close to any of those team records. No young Blue Jays fan has ever seen anything like him. In burying the hatchet, the Jays genuinely got to celebrate number 37, who helped make them who they are. All of these things represent enormous growth and maturity, but to repeat myself, maturity isn't the only thing that matters. This comeback, which at first seemed delusional to some until it suddenly very much was not, was one final act of belligerence from Stieb. Only this time, he didn't direct it toward an error-prone teammate, the bosses, the media, or himself. The fates had beaten him all up and down the American League for ages. This minor miracle, this defiance of those fates who declared his career dead, was one last finger to all of them on his way out the door. And finally, this return to baseball earned him perhaps the most poetic final moment a ballplayer has ever had. Everyone remembers the final games of guys like Derek Jeter and Ted Williams, but this one was so subtle that I'd imagine very few in attendance that day even noticed. We hope you can appreciate the magnificence of this. Roy Halladay loses a no-hitter with 1 out to go, ensuring that the man who catches this fateful baseball, the man who has suffered this outcome himself 3 times, remains the only Toronto Blue Jay ever to complete a no-hitter. It's just about impossible to fully nail down the odds of this, but once again, I think we owe it to him to do our best, huh? 4 conditions need to be met, right? First, Stieb has to make the near-miraculous comeback after an approximate 5-year layoff to even put himself in that bullpen in the first place. And not a cup of coffee either. He has to stay there for the rest of the season, until the very end. There's such little precedent for this that I'm not even going to try to calculate the odds, so let's just stick a question mark there. We're off to a great start. Next, Halladay has to have a no-hitter broken up after 8 2/3 innings. Outside of this one, between 1988 and 2021, there have been 27 such games across a total of about 155,000 games, putting the odds at 1 in 5,757. Next, we need to get this ball over the fence in left field. Sure, it's conceivable that a ground rule double could get it to Stieb as well, but since he's standing right up next to the fence, I don't see that happening, so we need a homer to dead left. Excluding this at-bat, of Bobby Higginson's 1,335 career hits, 6 were home runs straight to left field, putting the odds of that at 1 in 222. Multiply these two factors and you have 1 in close to 1.3 million, but we still have a lot of work to do. It has to fit through this window, let's say about a 2-foot wide window, in order for Stieb to be able to turn around and catch the ball off the carom without even taking a step. I've measured that wall in dead left at 142 feet long, which would make the odds of this 1 in 71, and that puts the combined odds at 1 in about 90 million multiplied by whatever the hell the value is here. This was the likelihood of us seeing this poetry in the final seconds of Dave Stieb's career. It feels like he received one final goodbye from an old friend, whoever or whatever that friend was in nature. For all the significance of his comeback, it did produce another effect for Stieb. It completely reset the clock on his Hall of Fame candidacy. The rules state that players must be inactive from the majors for 5 full seasons before they're eligible to appear on the ballot. Had he stayed on track for his first ballot appearance in 1999, the memories of his heroics would have been a little more fresh. Now, with his name hitting the ballot for the first time in 2004, they've fallen much further out of view. After his small contributions in 1998 are added, Stieb's career wins above replacement, a metric that in 2004 the vast majority of voters do not know or care about, has increased by 0.1.
With 506 total ballots that year, 380 votes are required to secure the 75% necessary for induction into the Hall. This blue bar represents Stieb's career WAR of 56.5, and we know it'll be awfully tough to land that high in the first year of eligibility. Although who knows, even there it'd seem like he'd have a puncher's chance. For instance, Dennis Eckersley, whose time in the bigs spanned roughly the same period, also ending in 1998, had a relatively comparable career to Stieb, the former with more longevity and a greater WAR, the latter with a greater peak and a better ERA. With both hitting the ballot for the first time in 2004, Eckersley received a thumbs up from over 83% of the voters, comfortably clearing the threshold of 75% on his very first chance. And another 3 of these guys with a career WAR lower than Stieb's, the aforementioned Kirby Puckett along with Mariano Rivera and David Ortiz, also got their ticket punched to Cooperstown on their initial opportunity. Rivera, in fact, was voted in on each and every one of the 425 ballots cast in 2019, becoming the first player to ever be unanimously selected. So we're dealing with a universe in which he pulled that off on the back of a sub-Stieb career WAR of 56.3, and Whitaker, whose career WAR was over a full third higher than Rivera's, got fewer than 3% of the votes. It doesn't get much more arbitrary than that, and it all seems pretty flawed, so there'd be no shame in falling short of the magic 380 number when the majority of voters felt the literal eponym of the Cy Young Award was not a Hall of Famer his first time on the ballot. Stieb could fall anywhere along this plane, but as long as he just gets the 26 votes that constitute 5% of the 506 ballots, he'll live to fight another day. Our man, who arguably should have won Cy's award for 3 or 4 straight years in the early to mid-80s, if not for receiving from voters all the respect of a substitute teacher on the last day of school, now receives from the same 506 writers who gave Eckersley 421 votes. Seven votes.
That, it has been decided, is what all of this is worth. 7 votes. 7 votes out of 506. 499 people decided that his Odyssey was not even worth a second look, and all 499 of those people were handed a ballot. It's not just that he didn't make it to 5%. He didn't even really get close. Those 7 votes represent 1.4%. That's a wrap. Dave Stieb will never appear on a BBWAA ballot ever again. What did him in? Probably a whole lot of things. Lending credence to the idea that playing in Canada damages your candidacy is the showing of longtime teammate Jimmy Key, who also had a terrific career and ended up in the same weeds Stieb did. But we've got to imagine that the delay he caused with his comeback was a major factor. More recently retired players were hitting the ballot for the first time and soaking up the attention. A lot of voters have internalized the idea that it's somehow distasteful to vote for more than X number of players on any given ballot. If he'd stayed retired after 93 and landed on the ballot in 99, I'm sure he wouldn't have hit 75% on the first try, but I'm also fairly confident that he could have at least put his ship out to sea with a showing of better than 5%. If he had just managed to get that far, then maybe, over the course of many years, he could have attracted enough sentiment to eventually tow him to port. They just didn't give him the time of day. If I'm reading the language right, he could have remained eligible if his comeback had fizzled out in the minor leagues like it absolutely was supposed to. But, as he always has, throughout his entire baseball life, he defied every last expectation that was placed upon him and ignored what he was quote-unquote supposed to be able to do. I believe that success, strangely, is what cost him. But do you remember what he said in his book, all the way back when? When he talked about the Hall of Fame, he imagined that any Hall of Famer would, if it came down to it, give up their plaque if it meant just one more afternoon at the yard. Years and years prior, buried in page 18 of a book everyone had long since forgotten about, he called his shot. This is, in effect, exactly what he did. This Dave Stieb, the Stieb of 1998, held no illusions of winning a Cy Young Award or even pitching for long enough to pad his career numbers. He'd already won a ring in '92, and he surely didn't have any expectations of pitching in a World Series with a Blue Jays team that was coming off 4 consecutive losing seasons. He had no more whales to catch. It wasn't about that anymore. It was about the pure delight of being on the mound and making a baseball do impossible things. The delight that, in his younger years, he'd often forgotten to experience. Maybe the privilege of staying out there just a little bit longer was worth giving up his shot at the Hall of Fame, but doesn't mean he didn't want it. In 2017, the Sporting News catches up with him and finds him doing the same thing Alex and I are doing, staring at baseballreference.com and trying to piece together how the hell it happened. Stieb wasn't asking for a lot. He really wasn't. In fact, he doesn't even consider himself worthy of the Hall of Fame. But it sure would have been nice to stay on the ballot, to send his name and his story across the block just a couple more times. It hurts. It really, genuinely hurts. Alex and I fully agree with Stieb here. Receiving just 7 votes of recognition out of more than 500 is an insult, and he deserved far better. However, when he says he's not a deserving Hall of Famer, on that point, we do not agree. All hope is not lost. This story is not over yet. Not even now, in the year 2022. There is still one avenue through which Dave Stieb could become a Baseball Hall of Famer. Introducing the Era Committee.
Formerly known as the Veterans Committee, the Era Committee is basically a vehicle that attempts to right the past wrongs made by the BBWAA as to players who have burned through their eligibility there. As of 2016, it works like so. Prospective Hall of Famers who have been passed over for induction by the BBWAA are assigned to one of 4 eras, depending on whether their greatest contributions to baseball came before 1950, known as the Early Baseball Era, in the 50s or 60s, which is the Golden Days Era, between 1970 and 1987, the Modern Baseball Era, or since 1988, the Today's Game Era. Each era comes with a ballot featuring 10 candidates that are voted on by a committee of 16 members comprised of Hall of Famers, team execs, and media members. Like the BBWAA election, one needs to get voted in on 75% of the ballots to earn induction. Stieb falls within the modern baseball era, whose committee meets twice every 5 years to consider players for the Hall. The 10 names on the ballot are selected by the Historical Overview Committee, a subset of the BBWAA, so not exactly an independent process here. And it shows. The first time the Modern Era Committee gathered to vote was for the class of 2018, and Stieb didn't even make the ballot. Jack Morris did, though, and somehow he even got more than the 12 votes necessary to reach Cooperstown. When Stieb's next chance to get inducted by the Modern Era Committee rolled around 2 years later, same story. Once again, he couldn't even crack the ballot. After getting just 1.4% of the vote his first, last, and only time on the original BBWAA ballot, now he can't even get listed on the ones that are supposed to correct that mistake. It's hard to tell what exactly the holdup has been here, but hey, humans do make mistakes, and correcting mistakes is this committee's specialty. No better time to do so than 2023. Because as we're about to see, this ballot is absolutely where Dave Stieb belongs. Here are the first 17 pure pitchers inducted into the Hall of Fame in the 21st century, plotted by their career ERA and WAR. Now here is Dave Stieb, who's pretty perfectly ensconced alongside the others. You almost couldn't be more optimally positioned to fit right in. He is the sun of the Hall of Fame solar system, about which all the planets are strewn. As for his peak, he had a 4-year run from 1982 to 85 with a complete stranglehold on his league's pitching. He was at or near the top of the league's leaderboard each year in both innings pitched and ERA, and whereas during his time a metric like wins above replacement wasn't available, which hurt his cause in Cy Young voting, that can now be rectified when it comes to Hall of Fame voting. There is simply no excuse to not account for something like that anymore, and this is what it looks like when we do. You could probably count on one hand the number of pitchers in history who separated themselves from the rest of their league to this degree over a 4-year span. Even beyond the remarkable peak, Stieb had 5 other good to great seasons, including 4 other All-Star selections, furthering the longevity element to his Hall of Fame case, in which he also excels. In fact, zooming out to look at the entire decade of the 80s, he pitched way more innings than anyone but Jack Morris. And whereas Morris's production was in the general range of average, Stieb had an ERA that was better than 41 of the decade's other 46 pitchers who tossed at least 1,500 innings. Let's then bring in our trusty WAR, where he was able to construct a skyscraper amid what for everyone else are, by comparison, a bunch of bungalows and gas stations. The runner-up here is Hall of Famer Bert Blyleven, whose 1980s WAR Stieb surpassed by a full 10. So not only was he clearly and unequivocally the pitcher of the 80s, but no one else in modern times dominated any decade relative to the field like Dave Stieb dominated the 1980s. Most decades have the WAR of MLB's top 2 within a pretty tight range of each other. Not the 80s though, where Stieb was in a class of his own. Of course, during his playing days, the key factor contributing to his constantly drawing the short straw was the media's irrational obsession with individual wins. We gotta be better than that now, and besides, even there, he did still have a winning record across his first 4 seasons when the Jays overall were the very worst team in MLB. But what Stieb's sparkling wins above replacement did do was directly translate to his team, winning. He was the best player for a team that then turned it around to have MLB's very best record over the ensuing 10 years to close out his first tenure with the club. The man most responsible, by far, for engineering that stunning reversal of fortune that culminated with the 1992 World Series title was Dave Stieb. That is a Hall of Famer.
I don't know what else you would call a player who made a footprint like this. But we're still not done. Let's return once again to our beloved dead horse. We have to revisit these Cy Young Award results. Stieb won none of them. We've already argued that he should have won at least 3. Now it's true that multiple Cy Youngs do not make you a Hall of Fame lock. Stieb's old rival Brett Saberhagen won 2, and despite career numbers that were pretty similar to Stieb's, he was disrespected as badly as Stieb was in Hall of Fame voting, never even making it to a second ballot. But still, a Cy Young Award can give you a hell of a lot of ballast when your candidacy is out to sea. 3 could keep you steady for years, ensuring you're on the ballot and being talked about while your case is being assembled. And it's important to understand how horrendous Stieb's luck really was in not getting any of those 3. Our case is leaning real heavy on war. I understand that's probably annoying to a few of you, and I'm sorry about that. But just in case you're still a little skeptical and on the fence about war, let me present you 2 pieces of evidence. The first one is more coincidence than anything, but it's fun. Stieb finished his Blue Jays career, which began in 1979 and ended in 1998, with 56.9 wins above replacement, implying that he was responsible for 56 entire wins more than they would have otherwise had. You want to guess how many games the Jays finished above 500 in this span? 56 on the dot. The second piece of evidence is a lot more substantial. We've taken every American League Cy Young Award winner in history and plotted them by how high they ranked league-wide in WAR. Those are in red. You can see that ever since the mid-90s, the leader in WAR is almost always also the Cy Young Award winner. And if not, usually at least top 3 or 4. That's because voters started relying upon more useful stats, including eventually WAR itself. Now, here's some evidence that WAR is really onto something. In the 1960s and 70s, the voters have never heard of WAR because it does not exist. They're flying blind on this chart, and yet, for the most part, they agree with WAR. You can say the same of the voters of the late 80s, and that is what makes this so strange, this window between 1979 and 1984. They regressed. Their understanding of what the Cy Young Award was and who it belonged to grew muddier, not clearer. They collectively lost all sense, giving it to arguably the 13th best pitcher in the league, then later the 27th best, then the 19th best. These lost years, the ones in which Cy Young voters wandered the streets and handed the award to random passersby, coincide just about perfectly with the career peak of Dave Stieb, seen here in blue. He led the league in WAR 3 straight years. He finished in the top 3 5 straight years. If he had done this at any other point in history, he would have won twice, maybe 3 times. It gets pretty funny for him later too. In 1989, he ranks 22nd in WAR. It looks as though the voters say, nope, sorry Dave, we're looking for #1 material. So the next year, Stieb does all he can to get to the top, finishing a very impressive 3rd. And then the voters say, oh, you know what, Dave, sorry, we actually want the 22nd best after all. How on earth do you explain these voting patterns? What was going on within the media class in the 1980s? I guess we'll never know. You know, Alex put it perfectly earlier. Dave Stieb was so outstanding and in such a class of his own that he's never once had to rely on good luck. He can even make his way around consistent bad luck. That's how brightly he shines. All he ever needed was to not be routinely saddled with the very worst luck in the universe. And yet, that's the luck he got. That is why he's outside of the Hall of Fame looking in. And that's why this is not a charity case. It's a correction of the record. An acknowledgement that he deserves to have a plaque in that building, and he always did. Although Stieb's story is incredible, we understand that simply authoring an incredible story is not enough to get you in the Hall of Fame. But I'd argue that the story of baseball cannot be fully told without him. And if you're this consequential to the game's history, they gotta hang up a plaque for you. This, for instance, is why someone like Curt Flood should absolutely be in there. Stieb's contributions were very different in nature, but unmistakable. The Blue Jays' back-to-back World Series titles represented an enormous sea change. 100 years from now, if Caracas wins the World Series, or Munich wins the Super Bowl, or Shanghai wins the NBA Finals, it won't be because of the Blue Jays, but we will look back on these titles as the first steps. They established that baseball no longer belonged just to Americans. It belonged to everyone. They were 2 of the most historically significant World Series wins ever. Would they have won them without Dave Stieb? Well, of course he didn't even play in either of them. and they needed to spend big in free agency to put themselves over the top. But if it weren't for that first step, that excruciating 7-game loss in the 1985 ALCS that likely wouldn't have even happened in the first place were it not for Stieb, this proof of concept wouldn't have been fully established. But that series completely changed everyone's expectations of this franchise. They weren't just some international concession, some cellar dweller for the purpose of building interest in Canada and selling a few tickets when the big-name American stars came to town. They were here to show up and beat everybody, and they did it twice in a row. Only the Yankees have done that since. This is a team sport. The contributions of Tony Fernandez, Jimmy Key, Barfield, Mosby, Clancy, Bell, McGriff, Witt, and Hankey were crucial, but Stieb's heroics tower above everyone else's. He, more than anyone, stoked the flames and established that they had something here, that this was a team worth investing in and breaking the bank for. If he'd never arrived in Toronto, this might well have ended up just another baseball team. And you know what? Putting Stieb in the Hall of Fame would make for one hell of a tribute to all the Canadian baseball fans whose patience and unconditional support made this possible. The best thing Major League Baseball could do is put a team back in Montreal, but maybe the next best thing would be to honor the player who has accomplished more in a Canadian uniform, by a large margin, than any other baseball player in history. I mean, listen, did you know that Canadians buy milk in bags? They take a bag of milk and bring it home, and then they have to cut it open with a pair of scissors and put it in like some other container. Please help these people. Unlike virtually any other pitcher you can name, Dave Stieb did not grow up aspiring to pitch. He never wanted to be the next Sandy Koufax or Steve Carlton. He never wanted to be the next anybody. He followed nobody's blueprint. He drew his own. There was no more appropriate place he could have landed than Toronto's brand new baseball franchise. It had no legacy, no former greats he would be compared to. Only a blank slate. It was up to him and his teammates to write this team's story. And they did so brilliantly. Maybe in the end, none of this moves the needle at all. Maybe the modern baseball committee remains unconvinced. Maybe none of this ever makes it to their desk in the first place. All Stieb ends up with is a documentary made by a couple of dorks. But it cannot go unsaid. Dave Stieb is one of one. There was no one else like him.
Between the injuries that derailed his career in the early 90s and his unprecedented comeback in the late 90s, by the time Dave Stieb's first year of Hall of Fame eligibility rolled around in 2004, it had been close to 15 years since he was in peak form. Surely that comeback restarting the clock played a significant role in what can only be interpreted as a complete lack of respect by the BBWAA, with memories of the dominance of the best pitcher of his era being lost to the sands of time. That he was victimized by his own success with his comeback bid shockingly reaching the big league summit is a cruel fate, but it did grease the skids for the surreal sequence of events that marked the final moments of his career. Sitting in the bullpen while Roy Halladay was 1 out from joining him in the Blue Jay No-Hitter Club, a club in which he'd been the sole member for 8 years after becoming king of the 26-out heartbreak, Stieb overcame incalculably long odds and bending fate to almost magnetically draw to himself the 26-out home run ball that ensured he'd remain the sole member then, too. 11 years later, by the end of 2009, Halladay had spent 15 remarkable years in the Blue Jays organization, even winning in 2003 the AL Cy Young Award that Stieb had always coveted, but he still had never gotten over the no-hitter hump. Then the next year in 2010, Halladay did indeed throw not one, but 2 of them, one of which was a perfect game, and the other of which was just the second to ever occur in the postseason. However, in another twist of fate, that was his first season in Philadelphia after the Jays traded their ace as he approached the final season of his contract. Thanks to both Halladay's own unique and incredibly unlikely experience of 26-out pain and waiting until his first year out of Toronto to throw his no-hitters, Dave Stieb remained, as of 2022, the only Blue Jay to ever pitch a no-hitter. For Halladay, those no-nos were crowning achievements of a career that landed him in the Hall of Fame after his first time on the ballot. That honor was, of course, the polar opposite of Stieb's lone experience on the BBWAA ballot, which was delayed to his detriment by his unretirement. But as for his 1998 return to baseball, a return that enabled his last week in the big leagues to overlap with Halliday's first week in the big leagues, and which forever links the two together given how subsequent events unfolded, no one at the time could have realized just how poetic that intersection would really be.
Now, at last, we'll put down the calculator and simply delight in what we've seen. The two greatest Toronto Blue Jays of all time. One beating back impossible odds to pass the torch on to the next. The second finally achieving so many of those conquests the first could only dream of. Before ultimately giving way to the rookie, Stieb was originally penciled in to make the start for the Blue Jays on this Sunday, the final game of the season and of his career. That's a basic idea, a human idea of a beautiful ending, but the universe is the true artist among us. It knew how this needed to end. Remember that Higginson, a feared power hitter, was a pinch hitter on this day. Sending him out there wasn't a no-doubt decision. Some managers would have done so as a point of pride, determined to avoid seeing their team get no hit. Others would look around, see all the fans cheering on this kid an inch away from history, and on the last game of a losing season, roll the dice with the hitter they've got and allowing whatever happens to happen. Detroit's manager, Larry Parrish, makes the call that ruins this no-hitter and sends that ball straight into Stieb's hands. You want to guess which hitter lit up Stieb more than any other hitter in baseball with an obscene OPS north of 1,400 across about 40 encounters? This is one of those things that nobody noticed. The universe just seems to do for its own amusement. Stieb says it was around the 5th inning of Halliday's start that he began to wonder about a no-hitter. He thought back to all of his, the one that was and all the others that could have been. I wonder whether the rules allow for a player to make a mound visit from the bullpen, take the whole long walk out from the outfield. I don't think the question's ever come up. This may have been the one and only time it might have been warranted, with the rookie 1 out away from a no-hitter and the world's foremost no-hitter expert just standing around out there. It's fun to wonder what Stieb would have told him. He might have suggested starting off Higginson by throwing out of the zone, pitch around him a little, walk him, and battle the next guy if you have to. Stieb spent years and years ferociously pushing forward and attacking the plate, and it was only when he walked the red-hot Alex Cole on 4 pitches, when he learned patience, when he learned how to let go just a little bit, that he solved the riddle. But the riddle is never the same for any two people. Throwing outside of the zone is, of course, exactly what Halliday did, and the Fates almost seemed to delight in shutting him down with an opposite field home run off the bat of a man who never hit opposite field home runs. Halliday would finish this conquest one day, but he was only on the first few steps of his own adventure. We found so much magic in the story of Dave Stieb, but it's always the magician who's least impressed. He took this ball, one of the most poetry-infused balls ever hit, and unceremoniously dumped it in a bag with all the others they tossed to kids in the crowd at the end of a game. Right now, maybe it's sitting in someone's attic somewhere in Ontario, buried in a box with all the other little miracles we seem to love to forget. But he didn't need it anymore. It was just another baseball.